This hearing will get underway. Welcome. We've got an opportunity today to hear from some nominees to the Federal Communications Commission, a critically important agency with a very wide and critical jurisdiction in our economy. So we're going to proceed right to that. Because we have some time constraints that we have to deal with today, I'm going to forego my opening statement and ask unanimous consent that it be entered into the record, and we'll proceed directly to some of the introductions that we're going to hear, and then hopefully to our panel. I think Senator Nelson wants to make an opener, and we'll do that right after we recognize Senator Roberts, the distinguished senior senator from Kansas, who is here, and he's going to open things up for us this morning. Senator Roberts.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Coop. Ranking Member Nelson, my seatmate and fellow Senator, Senator Moran, and members of the committee. It is a great privilege for me to introduce a friend and fellow Kansan, Ajit Pai, for his reappointment to the Federal Communication Commission. It isn't often that I find myself on this side of the dais, but I have to imagine, Ajit, that on an occasion such as this, I must be calmer than you are. That's sort of an inside story. My staff wrote that. I have no idea what it means. Anyway.
You look really nervous.
Yeah. It's hard to believe more than 5 years have already passed since Jerry and I introduced Ajit for his first confirmation hearing to serve at the FCC. At that hearing in 2011, I highlighted his impressive professional background, both in government and the private sector, a background that made clear he was a talented young man capable of leadership at the highest levels. But today, having served as commissioner and now chairman at the FCC, Ajit's record of success speaks for itself. In his time at the FCC, he has taken on dreaded robocalls. He has increased transparency and accountability by releasing commission documents to the public prior to agency votes. He has traveled the country, highlighting challenges and opportunities for rural consumers who currently lack sufficient access to broadband. So more than anything, I want to thank him for his dedicated work on behalf of consumers across the country and especially for Kansans. Ajit, I want to thank you for joining me in Allen, Kansas last fall to highlight the importance of the work rural providers are doing to connect families and small businesses in rural communities to the broadband that is so vital to success in today's economy. As chairman of the Agriculture Committee, I regularly hear from farmers and ranchers who have come to rely on broadband to run their operations and to connect to customers and markets all around the world. And I take heart in the fact that those constituents who feed the nation and the world have a fearless advocate at the helm of the FCC who understands the great challenges that lie ahead in closing the digital divide between rural and urban communities. So to my colleagues on this committee, I urge a swift confirmation from my friend and proud Kansan, Ajit Pai. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. And I always tell Senator Roberts when he talks, if you close your eyes, you can kind of hear Paul Harvey. Doesn't it sound a little bit like Paul Harvey? Thank you, Senator Roberts. I'm going to turn now to Senator Nelson for his opening remarks, and then we will go to some other introductions of some of our panelists today. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there seems to be some passing interest in this subject matter today. It would be impossible to get all these people into our little committee room, so thank you all for all being here. And it's because everybody here understands that the Commission plays such a vital role in protecting consumers and competition, and it's incumbent upon us to review the qualifications to carry out the role of all persons nominated to serve as commissioners to this agency. For Jessica Rosenworcel, it's been a long and winding road, when in reality, she should already well be into her second term on the agency. I want to thank you for your patience, your perseverance, and your continued willingness to serve the public. Your expertise your good judgment, the dedication to the public interest is noted, and it is essential. Mr. Carr, congratulations on your nomination. There you are. It seems clear that you are well-liked and well-regarded by the communications bar. And I enjoyed my meeting with you yesterday. We have concerns about 2 consecutive terms, not 1 term, but 2 consecutive terms, to which the Senate is being asked to confirm you, and it would provide you with the longest single initial period of service of any nominee to the FCC. In addition, it's hard to recall a similar situation where someone was nominated to serve at the commission alongside rather than to follow their current boss. We must have commissioners with an independent voice at this critical independent regulatory agency, and ones who will fight for consumers and the public interest. And that's why I will urge our colleagues to take a particularly hard look at the question of 2 consecutive terms. It seems to me that the wiser course would be to hold this hearing, consider the gentleman's qualifications, and if he's confirmed, then see how he does over the next couple of years before confirming him to an additional term on top of the original one at this agency. And finally, let me welcome back Chairman Pai. You've been busy since your last appearance. I want to give you due credit for the many of the actions the FCC took at the open meeting last week. They included several solid pro-consumer actions aimed at improving the lives of Americans. Many view these most recent consumer protection actions, however, as mere icing on what is an unwise, unpalatable cake, a cake constructed out of actions that would eliminate competitive protections that threaten dangerous industry consolidation, that make the Internet less free and less open, and that weaken critical consumer protections for those most vulnerable. Many of us cautioned you earlier in the year that we would judge your success at the agency on your ability to put the public interest ahead of certain special interest. And there are a number of us that are concerned, are you heeding that advice? And that advice was offered from our heart. Ultimately, we need commissioners who have consumers' backs. We need commissioners who are not afraid to use the robust statutory authority Congress has given to the FCC to protect consumers. And on behalf of those consumers, this committee is going to be overseeing and doing our duty as the oversight committee, and we'll be doing that robustly. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. And I'm going to ask if our 3 nominees would come forward, and they are very well qualified nominees, Chairman Pai, Mr. Carr, Ms. Rosenworcel, as we consider nominations to serve as commissioners at the Federal Communications Commission. And I also want to, before we go any further, welcome, I know there are a number of the families of the nominees who are here today, and thank you for being here, and thank you for being a part of public service, which I know comes in many cases with a great sacrifice on behalf of the families. I'm going to flip it now to our other senator from Kansas, a member of this committee, Senator Moran, to introduce Chairman Pai, and then following that, we're going to recognize Senator Blumenthal for 2 minutes to introduce Jessica Rosenworcel, and then Senator Gardner is going to introduce Brendan Carr. So we'll go in that order: Senator Moran, Blumenthal, and Gardner, and then we will get to the remarks from our nominees. So, Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to the ranking member. I join my colleague from Kansas in welcoming Ajit Pai and his family to the Commerce Committee of the United States Senate. I consider Ajit a friend, which is a word that you have to choose carefully around here so that it retains any meaning. But I also consider Ajit one of the most intelligent and hardworking, diligent public servants that I've ever met in my time in Congress and as a citizen before elective office. And I've seen him in Kansas and I've seen him in Washington, D.C. We appreciate the fact that he remains a Kansan, even when he's surrounded by the temptations and influences of the nation's capital. So I consider him also a person of integrity, common sense, and good judgment. I had conversations with both Jessica Rosenworcel and Mr. Carr in recent days. In both instances, I asked them to hold Ajit accountable and to bring the FCC to a point in which it was a significant amount of camaraderie and cooperation. The last time that Chairman Pai was in front of this committee, I indicated to the other commissioners that if he failed to do that, that I would call his mom and dad at home and ask them to intervene. And I have no doubt that that will not be necessary. We want an FCC commission that works together, that even in differences of views and policy perspectives, takes the higher road that says we're going to find, when we can, common ground, and we're going to work together with respect and dignity for all commissioners, something I think that this committee would appreciate, particularly based upon past kind of circumstances. So I'm really here to just say, Ajit, thank you for your public service. I look forward to your confirmation. And believe that you are totally worthy of the opportunity to serve Americans in the capacity that the President has asked you to serve. And I will ask my colleagues to join me in that confirmation.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't be more delighted and proud to welcome Jessica Rosenworcel here today, along with her family, Emmett and Mark. They come from a wonderful family in West Hartford, and she has really served with extraordinary distinction and dedication, not only at the FCC, but also with this committee. And I would be remiss in letting this moment pass without paying tribute to two of the giants who have served on this committee, Senators Jay Rockefeller and Daniel Inouye, because she worked with them as their counsel. She has been a champion of issues so very important to everyone on this committee on a bipartisan basis: our schools, our local emergency responders, everyday consumers. I've been privileged to welcome her several times to Connecticut, where she has championed the interests of victims of cramming and also the homework gap, which the Hartford Courant recognized just a few days ago in an editorial, a term that she coined. She has been a tireless advocate of public safety, working to update the FCC's 9/11 rules to keep communities safe and protected, and she's been at the forefront of pushing the FCC to creatively update our spectrum policy and unlicensed use. I hope to continue to welcome her back to Connecticut on issues like the pervasive scourge of robocalls, which she visited Connecticut to highlight. And I want to thank her, and again to her family, in fact to all of the families who are here today, because I know that your service is really worthy of recognition. You are the ones who devote the time and effort to your spouses, your parents, your loved ones, and I look forward to Commissioner Rosenworcel's very prompt confirmation. It is, as Ranking Member Nelson said, overdue, and I look forward to working with all of the nominees and congratulate you on your nominations. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome Ajit Pai, Jessica Rosenworcel, and Brendan Carr to the committee today. I have the great privilege and honor of introducing Brendan to the committee today. Before I begin that, though, I would like to send a strong message to Ajit, as I do to all Kansans. Just remember, it's our water. I am not from Virginia, but because Brendan does not have a Virginian on the committee, they selected the next best thing, and that is Colorado. At least part of it's in the Union today because of a Virginian, thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. So welcome to the committee today, Brendan. It's an honor to have you here. Brendan's dedicated his professional life to telecommunications policy. After receiving his undergraduate degree at Georgetown University, he continued his education in telecommunications law at Catholic University here in Washington, worked as a telecom attorney before joining Chairman Pai's staff as his lead advisor on wireless, public safety, and international issues. He now serves as the FCC's general counsel, acting as the chief legal advisor for the commission. During his time at the FCC, Brendan twice had the opportunity to visit the great state of Colorado. I was fortunate enough to have him accompany me around the state on one of those trips. We had the opportunity to visit startups in Denver. Of course, Colorado, a great startup state. We met with local broadcasters and rural broadband providers and toured a 911 emergency call center. Throughout the tour, I was impressed with his grasp of telecommunications policy across the wide range of issues before the FCC, and I believe he would make an outstanding commissioner. And he is certainly committed to the success of our urban corridors of this country, but equally important, the rural corridors of our nation as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Brendan to the committee, and I look forward to hearing him discuss what he sees as his potential role and opportunities ahead of us at the commission. Thank you, and welcome to your family as well.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. And we've got a vote at 10:30, and I'll just inform members of the committee we're going to roll through that to try and keep the process moving forward, and would ask the nominees, if they could, confine their oral remarks as close to 5 minutes as possible, give an optimum amount of time for members of the committee to ask questions. So I'm going to start on my left and your right with Chairman Pai, and then we'll recognize Jessica Rosenworcel and Brendan Carr. Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing today. It's been an honor to work with you on many issues. With the committee's indulgence, I'd like to introduce my family, my wife, Janine, our children, Alexander and Annabelle, collectively the Nuggets, and my brother-in-law, Bob Van Lanker, and his fiancée, Rachel Vistica. I'm grateful to them for their love and support. I'd especially like to thank my parents, Verdraj and Radha Pai, who traveled from Kansas to be here today. 46 years ago, they left India with little more than $10 and a transistor radio. Today, here they sit before distinguished members of this august body, their son having been nominated by the President of the United States to this important post. Only in America. I also would like to thank President Trump for nominating me to serve another term at the FCC, and to Senator Roberts and Senator Moran for their longstanding support and their kind introductions this morning. Finally, I want to congratulate Jessica Rosenworcel and Brendan Carr on their nominations. If confirmed, these talented public servants each will serve with great distinction. Over the past several years, you have come to know me and where I stand. Over the past several months, you have seen this FCC's work, from closing the digital divide, to combating illegal robocalls, to making the agency more transparent. And I'm sure we'll discuss some of that work today. But I'd like to share some perspectives from outside the Beltway. One of my favorite poems is Walt Whitman's Song of the Open Road. In one passage, Whitman writes of the people he has met. I carry them, men and women. I carry them with me wherever I go. I swear it is impossible for me to get rid of them. I am filled with them, and I will fill them in return. I can understand what Whitman meant, for I have had the privilege of meeting countless people during my time at the FCC, both in Washington and around the country. Those stories stay with me. I carry them wherever I go. They fuel my passion to help deliver digital opportunity to all Americans. I carry with me Steve Poirier. During my visit to the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in Mission, South Dakota, he told me about a woman who was found dead in her home, clutching her cell phone. She had dialed for help 38 times, but the call never went through because there was no wireless coverage. I carry with me Mike Roth of Allen, Kansas. Mike runs a feedlot called 2i Feeders that uses broadband-based technologies to monitor every cow's unique intake in real time. That way, he can assure particular top-end buyers that his beef is of the highest quality. I carry with me Priya Narasimhan, a Carnegie Mellon professor. Several years ago, she founded Yinscam, a company that creates apps for sports teams and venues and sets up beacons that delivers highly localized information to fans. Its clients now include many sports teams, including her beloved Penguins. And her personal story is inspiring. Her family came to America via India and Zambia, and she is a great role model for Indian Americans and women in STEM fields. I carry with me Dr. Shazam Hussain of the Cleveland Clinic's Mobile Stroke Unit. A stroke patient's brain loses 2 million brain cells every minute. Dr. Hussain explained to me how connectivity has allowed the unit to cut the average time for stabilizing a patient by 38 minutes. I carry with me Mike Bosch, Andy Newton, Travis Carter, and Mark Hudson. Respectively, they help run competitive fiber providers, RG Fiber in Kansas, Southern Light along the Gulf Coast, U.S. Internet in Minnesota, and Rocket Fiber in Detroit. I have seen for myself how they are building high-speed fiber networks in small towns and big cities. And I've even strung some fiber for myself in the bayou outside Hammond, Louisiana, and in a crowded city block in Minneapolis. I carry with me Wayne Gilmore, who helps run my hometown radio station, KLKC. Wayne and others are enabling a new generation of Parsonians to make their own lifelong connections with the station and the town. I'll carry with me Alex Algard and the team at Haya, a Seattle-based company which helps consumers avoid unwanted robocalls. And speaking of, I carry with me Florence Friedman of New York City. Florence wrote to me calling robocalls the Wild West, an area of lawlessness. Hopefully you will put this high on your agenda. It really is disruptive to one's life. And last but certainly not least, I carry with me my coworkers at the FCC. They are the strongest assets this agency, any agency, could have, and it is an honor to work alongside them. Senators, these are just a few of the people and just a few of the stories that I carry with me every day. As Whitman put it, I'm filled with them. Should I be confirmed, I will do my best to ensure that the FCC fills them in return by empowering them to help Americans everywhere improve their lives through connectivity and technology. Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, thank you once again for holding this hearing. I look forward to answering your questions and to continuing to work with you and hopefully my colleagues in the time to come.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. Ms. Rosenworcel, welcome back to the committee.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today. I am honored to have been renominated by the President to serve as Commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission. And I'd like to begin by introducing my family. Sitting behind me is my husband of 17 years, Mark Balin. And sitting next to him is our son, Emmett Joseph, who is 7 years old. His 10-year-old sister, Caroline Francis, could not be here today. She sends her regrets because she's away at summer camp. As you may know, I previously had the honor of serving as commissioner, but I stepped down from this position at the start of this year, and I headed home. Since that time, I have had the sweet privilege of attending every school performance and Little League game, and I've had the opportunity to reacquaint myself with the world through my children's eyes and experiences as digital natives. And it's trite but true, but a little distance provides some perspective. And in my time away, one thing has become abundantly clear. The future belongs to the connected. No matter who you are or where you live in this country, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. The choices we make today about communications technology, infrastructure, and access are an inheritance for the next generation. How we grapple now with the disrupting and democratizing effects of digitization will play no small role in determining American success in the future. The stakes are high, so of course a little humility helps, and that is why I believe that the work of the agency must emphasize what is time-tested and enduring. To this end, I believe the work of the Commission must be guided by 4 essential values that have informed communications policies for decades. First, public safety. We need policies that ensure that our networks are available when the unthinkable occurs and we need them most. Second, universal access. We need policies that foster the deployment of modern communications, not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas. And third, competition, because competition, of course, is the best way to increase innovation and lower prices. And fourth and finally, consumer protection. Communication services are multiplying in our economy and in their importance in our daily lives. So we should always be on guard for opportunities to help consumers make good choices. These values derive from the law and informed my work at the Commission in the past, and that includes my efforts to strengthen 911 service, which were based on input from visits with first responders all across the country. It also includes my efforts to increase access to broadband in our schools and increase opportunities for digital age education. Furthermore, I am proud to have worked on spectrum policies for both licensed and unlicensed airwaves that have made this country's wireless markets competitive, innovative, and strong. However, there is more work to be done to bring communications policy into the future. And that includes work following the world's first spectrum incentive auctions, managing the impact of those auctions on our nation's local broadcasters, and building on our wireless success with the next generation of mobile service known as 5G. That's going to require new ideas to spur innovation, spark entrepreneurship, incentivize the deployment of new networks, and help bring the benefits of modern communications to everyone, everywhere across the country. If reconfirmed, I look forward to working with the individuals at this table and all others at the Commission. And if reconfirmed, I will be guided by the fundamental values in the law that I discussed with you here today. And if reconfirmed, I will continue to respect the priorities of this committee. In closing, thank you, Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenworcel. Mr. Carr, welcome to the committee.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Nelson, distinguished members of the committee, it's a privilege to appear before you today. I'm humbled by President Trump's decision to nominate me to serve as a commissioner at the FCC, and I'm honored to have this committee consider that nomination. I want to start by thanking you and your staffs for the courtesies you've shown me over the past few weeks. The chance to meet with you has given me the opportunity to learn more about the telecom and communications issues that are important to you and to your states. These meetings have only underscored the important role the FCC plays in the lives of all Americans, whether it's promoting broadband deployment, protecting consumers, or advancing public safety. And with the committee's indulgence, I would like to take a moment to introduce my family, my wonderful wife, Michaela, our two terrific boys, Quinn, who is 3, and Emmett, who is 6 months. We're just blessed to be their parents. I also want to introduce my parents, Tom Carr and Barbara Carr. And note that for my dad, this is a bit of a homecoming. His first job during college in D.C. was to work as a mail sorter in the post office here in Dirksen, so he's really glad to get the chance to come back. I also want to congratulate Chairman Pai and Commissioner Rosenworcel on their renominations. I've worked with both of them, as well as Commissioners Clyburn and O'Reilly at the FCC for a number of years now. I can say that they are all exceptionally thoughtful and dedicated public servants. I currently have the privilege of serving as the General Counsel of the FCC. It's not the first job I've had at the agency, however. I joined the Commission over 5 years ago now as a staffer during the Obama administration. I worked in the Office of General Counsel, providing advice to the Wireless Bureau, Public Safety Bureau, and International Bureau. I then had the chance to work on some of those same issues for then Commissioner Pai. My passion for technology, however, started well before I joined the agency. In fact, I went to law school over 15 years ago now, specifically for the purpose of studying telecommunications law and policy. After graduating, I worked at a law firm, where I gained broad experience in this area, and I later accepted a clerkship with a judge on the Fourth Circuit, which helped spark my interest in public service. Looking back, I've learned a lot in the past dozen years working in communications. I've come to know and admire the FCC's terrific staff. They are passionate about delivering for the public interest. I've come to understand the importance of bipartisan consensus and working towards common ground, and if confirmed, I would certainly work in that spirit as a commissioner. I want to talk briefly about the focus I bring to the commission if confirmed. First, we have a tremendous opportunity in the telecom space to create jobs, to spur investment, and to grow the economy for the benefit of all Americans. And I believe the FCC's policies should do just that. Broadband is certainly going to play a key role, whether it's the app economy that runs over high-speed connections, the workers that manufacture network infrastructure and deploy it, or the businesses that use those connections to reach customers around the world. Broadband can harness the talents of all Americans. It can create good-paying jobs, and it can help drive our nation's economic growth. Second, we must maintain the United States leadership in wireless as 5G and other advanced and competitive networks come online. Spectrum and infrastructure are going to be two key pieces of that, whether that's in connecting every American or the expanding Internet of Things. And finally, the FCC must always promote public safety. This includes speeding the transition to next generation 911 and ensuring that our first responders have the communications technologies they need to do their jobs. So in closing, I want to thank the committee again for taking the time to consider my nomination. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. I'm going to start off, and I'm going to ask, because we do have, we're going to have a vote coming here quickly, and then Republicans are all invited to the White House for a noon meeting. So we're going to have to try and wrap this up by that time. So if everybody can be respectful of everybody else's time, we'll try and move this along. Chairman Pai, Ms. Rosenworcel, and Mr. Carr, I know each of you appreciates the importance of cooperation between the FCC and Congress. Nevertheless, these nomination hearings give us an opportunity to underscore that point. If confirmed, will you pledge to work collaboratively with this committee and its members to provide solid, thorough, and timely responses to our requests for information?
Yes.
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 To the panel, in every broadband report since the FCC adopted its USF reforms in 2011, the Commission has stated that broadband is not being deployed to all Americans in a reasonable and timely fashion, while also noting the disparity of broadband between urban and rural areas. Nonetheless, many of the small providers deploying broadband to the hardest-to-serve parts of America have seen USF funding for their project cut repeatedly and in increasing amounts. The law requires the FCC to ensure broadband is made available in rural areas in a manner that's reasonably comparable to services in urban areas, but by its own account, the FCC has failed to do so. To each of you, I would ask, will you commit to conducting a thorough economic analysis of the impact of these cuts on broadband deployment in rural areas before allowing any further reduction in the percentage of recovery for high-cost areas?
Yes.
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 Thank you. Chairman Pai, you have proposed an FCC inquiry to evaluate new uses for mid-band spectrum, something that I called for in a letter to you last month. How can Congress support the FCC's efforts to bring mid-band spectrum forward for commercial use in a timely fashion, and what key issues does the FCC think will need to be addressed to make this happen?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. I think you highlighted in your letter one of the key areas of action that has long been dormant to the FCC. We traditionally have focused on bands below 3.7 gigahertz and above 24 gigahertz. And pursuant to your letter, we took a look at the lay of the land and thought this is ripe for a notice of inquiry. And so recently I proposed to my colleagues, and we'll be voting on soon, a notice of inquiry that would tee up a variety of bands between 3.7 and 24 gigahertz. In particular, the 3.7 band, the 5.9 band, and the 6.4 4 gigahertz bands. We are hopeful that these bands in particular will generate substantial public comment and that we will be able to maintain U.S. leadership in spectrum policy by figuring out which areas are possible for license in and license innovation going forward. In terms of the committee's efforts, we would certainly want to keep you informed every step of the way, and if you have particular views on bands that you think the FCC should be focusing on, we would certainly welcome that input.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel, at a hearing earlier this year on broadband infrastructure, we looked at how a number of states have passed legislation aimed at reducing barriers to broadband deployment. Some states and municipalities have streamlined their processes to foster private investment in new commercial services, while others have not. To help address existing barriers, we are also exploring potential legislative solutions. So the question is, apart from direct investment, what do you think can be done at the federal level to speed broadband infrastructure and deployment?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think there are a variety of things that can be done, some of which have been discussed before this committee, including dig once policies and ensuring that all federal actors use the same contracts to facilitate deployment on federal property. Furthermore, I think it would be useful for the FCC going forward to contact other federal actors in this country, like the Department of Transportation, the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that have facilities all across the country, and see if through a memorandum of understanding we can't reach a commitment that any efforts to deploy or co-locate on those facilities could be accomplished in a short period of time. With 1/3 of the nation's lands being federal lands, I think we can set a good example and hopefully export that example to municipalities across the country.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, the National Legal and Policy Center reports that 1.3 million comments were filed in the net neutrality proceeding are from, I should say 1.3 million comments filed, are from international filers, with more than 300,000 coming from the same address in Russia in support of the 2015 Title II rules. And there have been many other stories of fake or abusive comments being filed. So the question is, how do you weigh these kinds of suspicious comments with those comments that are more substantive and based on sound policy arguments?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. This is a key issue. Obviously, the FCC, in undertaking this notice of proposed rulemaking, wanted to establish an open process where anyone who had an interest in the issue could voice his or her views. And I understand that there have been concerns on all sides about the veracity of some of these comments. At the end of the day, once the comment period closes and the FCC's talented staff takes stock of the facts in the record, we are ultimately guided by the substantial evidence test, which is outlined in Section 706 of the Administrative Procedure Act and was expounded by the Supreme Court in the Consolo case in 1966. Essentially, the question is, has the agency collected evidence that a reasonable person would agree would be adequate to support whatever conclusions were ultimately made? That has long been our lodestar on this and any other issue that we contemplate. And so that's eventually the standard that we will apply, and we will figure out what the appropriate judgment is based on those facts that are in the record.
Thank you. Senator Nelson.
Mr. Chairman, isn't it interesting that we have to be concerned about comments being filed from Russia? It's a new day. Mr. Carr, I want to follow up a policy question that it's hard to recall a similar situation where someone was nominated to serve at the FCC alongside, rather than what has been typical, to follow their current boss. And, of course, it raises the question of independence. And it's necessary that this committee raise this question of independence. How independent can you be of Chairman Pai? Can you name for the committee a time at which you substantively disagreed with Chairman Pai on an FCC matter or proceeding?
Senator, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a good one. Independence is critically important for the agency and for the decision makers at the agency. I've been at the Commission for over 5 years in a variety of roles. I've had various clients in those jobs, and I've hoped that I've always served their interest. When I had the chance to work for the Commissioner, I gave him my best candid advice. Sometimes he took it, sometimes he didn't take it. What I can commit to you going forward is I'll make my own decisions. I'll call it the way I see it, based on the facts, the record, and what I think serves the public interest, independent of where other people come out. At the same time, I would hope that if confirmed, all 5 commissioners can find common ground far more often than not.
Okay, but that's not the question. The question is, can you name an instance, substantive disagreement, as we evaluate your independence?
Senator, thank you. As I noted, I gave him my best advice I could on a variety of issues. He didn't always agree with me on those, but given the importance of having sort of a candid and free exchange with staff, and I think I want to leave it at that for now, that I can commit to you going forward that I'm going to be independent in my decision making.
Well, we appreciate that commitment, but we've got to evaluate your independence. So you simply will not name an incident for the committee's evaluation where you might have disagreed with him.
Having been sort of a lawyer at the time for then Commissioner Pai, I think I just want to leave those discussions.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you see any instances in the future that you would disagree with him on?
I certainly have no interest in agreeing with him when I don't believe that that's the right outcome. As I've noted, my hope is the agency works best when we work in a bipartisan basis. I think the vast majority of what we do should be consensus-based. I would look to work with all commissioners if confirmed, but there's no one individual that once I make my mind up is going to move me off that position. I think my record over the years shows that I'm not a shrinking violet and am confident of standing on my own feet and making these decisions.
Mr. Carr, that is not confidence building of those of us who are wondering about your future independence from the boss that you have so ably served in the last number of years. Well, let me ask you about the E-rate program. It's a great success story of the 96 Telecom Act. As you know, students have access that they never had before. Just in my state alone, libraries have received over $160 million in E-rate funds in 2015, and this program, it's making a real difference in the lives of citizens in our state. The nation's students and the teachers and the libraries are going to hold us accountable for any changes if we roll back the E-rate program, a bipartisan program, I might say, that has been bringing internet connectivity and broadband to schools and libraries. So I asked the chairman on previous occasions, and I will ask you now, will you commit to wait? And I will remind you, the FCC previously said it would wait until at least next year before attempting to make changes to this critical program. We need to see how the FCC's previous E-rate modernization efforts are working in order to guarantee that the nation, and in particular our students, can realize the benefits from the reform efforts. Can you make that commitment?
Senator, thank you for the question, and thank you for the work that you've done on E-rate. I agree with you that this is a critically important program that is serving important needs. What I can commit to you is that I approach this issue with an open mind as to timing, as to outcome, and I don't have a sort of a preordained view of the approach here.
So you cannot commit to waiting before we get those reports on evaluating the E-rate program?
Oh, Senator, I think it's important that before making any changes to a program, we know that if it's working or if it's not working, if it needs a tweak or if it, in fact, does not need a tweak.
I didn't understand the question. Can you commit to waiting to see the evaluation before you start making changes to the E-rate program?
Sir, I'm not familiar with the specifics in terms of what that evaluation would be or what time frame it would be, but I can commit to you that I would not be making or casting a vote to change a program until we had information about whether it was working or not working.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Next up is Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. This hearing gives us a really good opportunity to talk about how the American people can best take advantage of emerging technologies that give people access to more information. We're currently facing a lot of problems in this area, challenges, I guess one could say. Some of those challenges are physical and logistical. Other challenges relate to and are the product of government interference, legal and regulatory problems that the federal government itself has created. The Federal Communications Commission's 2015 Open Internet Order is the perfect example of the intrusive, heavy-handed government regulation causing delay in industry, causing uncertainty in the industry, and in effect, in the long run, I believe, limiting access by the American people to this technology that has the ability to benefit so many people. A recent New York Times article claimed that total investment by publicly traded broadband companies increased by 5.3% between the as compared to the 2-year period immediately before the issuance of the 2015 order. That is, during the 2-year period encompassing 2013 and 2014, to the end of the 2-year period immediately following it. That is 2015 and 2016. But this claim highlights a couple of major problems that result from overregulation, and I'll address each of them in turn. First, it fails to disclose that that actual investment, what the actual investment in infrastructure is. This 5.3% figure that I cited from the New York Times study refers to total top-line investment, not to capital investment in the United States, not to expenditure in this type of infrastructure here at home. More accurately, domestic investment in broadband actually plummeted. It fell after the 2015 order, with some analysts finding reductions as large as 5.6%. So they're saying, in fact, that the relevant number actually went down to an even greater degree than the New York Times article was suggesting it went up. So first, dealing with this issue, Mr. Pai, while it may not be possible to prove causation here definitively, would you agree that the FCC's 2015 Open Internet Order has discouraged companies from investing in broadband infrastructure, especially in rural areas and among smaller ISPs in the United States?
Senator, that is one of the concerns that we have raised, and that's part of the reason why we're testing that proposition in the context of the current notice of proposed rulemaking.
Now, I want to follow up on that with my second point, the second concern I have with the point raised by the New York Times article. The second one is a little more abstract. If the Internet service providers are not investing in broadband infrastructure, then where is their money going? You know, they might conserve cash or pay dividends, but in many cases, Internet service providers choose simply to invest elsewhere, either overseas or in other industries. For example, AT&T announced shortly after the 2015 order was issued that it would spend over $3 billion in Mexico to expand access to 100 million potential subscribers by 2018. Just as in countless other industries, overwhelming regulation of the Internet in the United States promotes consolidation instead of competition and helps incumbents instead of disruptors, competitors. And one thing we know about competition is when we have more of it, prices go down and quality goes up. And the opposite happens when we have less of it. So, Mr. Pai, if our goal is to encourage domestic investment by and promote competition between Internet service providers in the United States, shouldn't we return to the Clinton-era light touch approach to the Internet?
Senator, that is what the FCC has proposed, and our goals here, of course, are to preserve the free and open internet that all of us cherish, and to promote the massive infrastructure and the investment that is necessary to connect rural and urban Americans alike with digital opportunity, and that's what we're exploring in the context of the current proceeding.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pai, in 2016, almost half of all venture capital funds invested in this country went towards Internet-specific and software companies. That's $25 billion worth of investment. At the same time, to meet Americans' insatiable demand for the Internet, U.S. broadband and telecommunications industry invested more than $87 billion in capital expenditures in 2015, and that's the highest rate of annual investment in the last 10 years. We've hit a sweet spot. The investment in broadband and wireless technology is high. Job creation is high. The venture capital investment in online startups is high. So these net neutrality protections are a problem that doesn't need any fixing. This system is working. Yet, Mr. Chairman, you're proposing to undo the open Internet order. What is the problem, Mr. Chairman, that you are trying to fix?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think one of the concerns that we have raised is that these regulations might be dampening infrastructure investment.
They might be, but there's no evidence of it.
Well, there has been evidence raised, and that's part of the reason why we are testing this proposition in the context of the notice of proposed rulemaking. Some had suggested the FCC should simply issue a declaratory ruling saying that the facts in the law are so, and that's the way it's going to be. But we wanted to test this proposition in an open and public process.
Well, you know, publicly traded companies are required by law to provide investors accurate financial information, including reporting any risks or financial burdens. However, I have found no publicly traded ISP that has reported to its investors by law that Title II has negatively impacted investment in their networks. Many, in fact, have increased deployment and investment. So what is the evidence that you're relying upon that you proceed with towards a potential repeal of these net neutrality protections?
Senator, the notice of proposed rulemaking, we cited some evidence that among the top 12 Internet service providers, in terms of size, that investment was down. Also, a number of smaller providers, including municipal broadband providers, fixed wireless providers, small cable companies, and others submitted evidence. But we want to hear that perspective as well that you just outlined. And so we want to make sure what are the facts in this context. And again, this is part of the reason why we have a notice and comment process, as opposed to simply an administrative decree that we find that these rules are in fact harming them. We're going to get rid of them immediately.
Yeah, well, since these net neutrality rules have been in place, the Internet has thrived. We've seen tremendous job creation. It's the spot where younger people, newer companies go. It's an entrepreneurial engine of growth, the greatest that we've had in generations in the country's history. And so from my perspective, as you look at this, I feel that the evidence right now is not there. And if it was, the companies, the broadband companies themselves would have been, in fact, providing that evidence to their investors in their filings, and they have not done so. So anecdotal evidence is not evidence. Okay, there is no factual basis for that change, and I just think it's going to go right to the heart of the Internet's growth and job creation in the coming generations. Now, if I could, just moving on to the E-rate, I was the House author of the E-rate when it passed in 1996 into law. Is there any question in your mind, Mr. Chairman, that this program is working and that the funding levels are at a level that that meet the needs of our country?
Senator, for years I've said that E-rate is a program worth fighting for, and that is not an abstraction to me. I have visited an Alaska Native school in Fort Yukon, Alaska. I've visited libraries in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I've seen how the program is working, and we want to extend that to every student and every library patron in the country.
So you will commit to us that you will preserve the success of this bipartisan program and not decrease its funding level? Make programmatic changes that undermine or weaken the E-rate?
Senator, we have not made any decisions on that score. We're trying at this point to make sure that the program works.
So you won't make a commitment that you won't reduce the funding?
Well, Senator, we're studying, obviously, ways to improve the program, if there's any way to make it
Ms. Rosenworcel, will you commit that you won't reduce the funding?
E-rate is our nation's largest education technology program, and it is a successful one. And I believe that the changes that were put in place in 2015 have been successful. They have reached schools and students in every state across this country.
Mr. Carr, will you commit that you won't reduce the funding?
Senator, thank you. I have an open mind as to what the budget and the number should be, and happy to make a decision when the record's developed on it.
Yeah, well, I haven't heard clear commitments, and I think that's very troubling, to be honest with you, because this is the democratizing force within our society. As each of you made clear, you believe that it's key for our future. Reducing the funding, of course, is not going to help to make sure that every child in our country has access to the technology they're going to need in order to compete not only in our own country, but globally in the 21st century. So I have not been satisfied with the answers which I've heard. Again, Ms. Rosenworcel, are you saying that you will not reduce the funding?
I will not reduce the funding.
Thank you. So, Mr. Carr, Mr. Pai, I wish that I heard the same commitment from you as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. I arrived at the appropriate time in which it's my turn to talk and also hold the gavel. Let me start with all three of our nominees. We're following the repack issue closely. Last week, the FCC announced that the total reported reimbursement costs received from broadcasters who are required to repack as a result of the spectrum auction was over $2.1 billion. We know that the allocation fund, the relocation fund, is only authorized to $1.75 billion. If that $2.1 billion is a correct number, then there is a significant funding shortfall. Any requests or suggestions that the Commission and Congress need to act to provide additional resources to prevent broadcasters from going dark? And do you believe that the 39-month repack deadline is sufficient?
Senator, thank you for the question. As you pointed out, the estimates have come in a little bit above $2.1 billion. Now, our fund administrator, as well as the FCC's career staff, will have to evaluate those cost estimates and determine whether they are appropriate or not. That number, 2.1, could go down, it could go up. But I am in a position to say at this point that we expect, our anticipation is, that the required expenses to reimburse these broadcasters will be above $1.75 billion. And so I would expect that it would be necessary, if broadcasters are to be harmless in this repack, that Congress would have to provide additional funding.
Either other nominees want to add anything? Let me follow up, if not, about the time deadline.
Oh, yes, Senator. So we are obviously, this is a very complex process. We have a number of different phases to which broadcasters have been assigned. We have also given broadcasters the opportunity to seek placement in a different phase, and some of them have taken advantage of that. So I'm not in a position at this point to say whether the 39-month period is not going to be sufficient, but if we get any semblance of a record that would suggest that it isn't going to be sufficient, then we will certainly notify the committee promptly.
Thank you. Let me turn to 5G. We're the world leader in 4G. I'm worried that we're not taking the necessary steps to maintain that leadership as we attempt to deploy 5G. I'm told by carriers that the regulatory barriers to deploy small cell networks are outdated, hampering investment and economic growth. Would you agree that 5G deployment is critical for our economy? And what steps, if so, is the FCC taking to eliminate barriers and cost to deployment?
Senator, I do believe it is absolutely essential for 5G to develop quickly, and our goal is to make sure that the U.S. is at the forefront of the innovation in 5G. There are two basic building blocks in terms of a successful 5G economy, in my view. One is spectrum, and one is infrastructure. With respect to spectrum, I think the agency has spoken for several years now with unified voice that we want to be as inclusive as we can in terms of low, mid, and high-band spectrum. We want to tee up as much spectrum as we can for commercial use and for 5G innovators to experiment agreement with, and that's part of the reason why, as I pointed out to Chairman Thune, that we've teed up this mid-band notice of inquiry that we'll be voting on August 3rd. In terms of infrastructure, you pointed out one of the key problems is that there's a lot of infrastructure that's required for 5G networks. Instead of large cell towers, we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of small cells and other small infrastructure. We need to make sure that our regulatory review is tailored to the nature of the deployment and to make sure that we work cooperatively with all stakeholders, including governments, in order to make sure that our 5G economy thrives consistent with the public interest.
Commissioner Rosenworcel or Mr. Carr?
Thank you for the question. On a going forward basis, the network topology of 5G is going to be very different than what it was in 4G. We're going to have small cells dotting our landscape. And so we're going to need to make sure that not just FCC policies, but national environmental policy and national historic preservation policies are adjusted to reflect the realities of those facilities, which are very different than traditional large cell towers or macro cells.
Thank you.
I would echo those same points. 5G deployment is going to look very different, and I tend to view it through not just innovations, but jobs and economy. If we get the framework right, it could be $275 billion in investment over the next decade to deploy 5G. That could be 3 million new jobs, and when you combine it with IoT, you're looking at a $1 trillion boost to the economy, so we need to get this piece of it right.
Thank you, all three. Let me ask Chairman Pai a final question. When do you expect to have the proceedings finalized and begin to make spectrum available, the status of the Spectrum Frontier proceedings?
Senator, we don't have a particular time frame that I can report to the committee at this point, but we are actively studying it, and we're working with stakeholders to figure out those parts of the Spectrum Frontier bands that were teed up where we can take action. And if there are other areas where more deliberation is needed, we will obviously put those on hold. So I can't give you a specific time frame, but I can tell you that it's the top priority in terms of spectrum policy at the Commission.
Thank you, all three. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the nominees, their families. Congratulations. I wanted to follow up on a question. Mr. Carr, I wanted to ask you the first question. Whether it's 7, 8, 9, 10 million comments, is it fair to say this is a record number of comments?
I believe that's right, Senator, yes.
So my question for you is, what weight does that get in the process? I understand you have a legal standard when considering this matter. But what weight does the fact that millions of people have expressed themselves with the FCC, a historic number, what weight does that get?
Thanks, sir. I think it's very important. I think it shows the level of interest and the passion in this issue, and that's something that we need to be taking into account.
Thank you. Commissioner Pai, during your confirmation hearing, I asked if you agreed with the President's comments calling the media the enemy of the state. At the time, you didn't answer the question totally on point, and I understand you're a Trump appointee and you're trying to strike that right balance in terms of being an independent agency, but still understanding that you're a Trump appointee and not wading into either presidential politics or partisan politics. But since then, the President has made a number of additional comments about the media. He consistently refers to the media as fake news media, garbage media, and made unsubstantiated claims about various networks and newspapers. For example, on July 2nd, the President posted a video of himself wrestling CNN with the hashtag #FraudNewsCNN. On June 28th, the President tweeted, "The Amazon Washington Post, sometimes referred to as the guardian of Amazon not paying internet taxes, which they should, is fake news." So the question I have for you, Chairman Pai, is since we last heard from you, and given that context, have there been any direct or indirect communications about the media between you, your office, and the White House that this committee should be aware of?
Senator, thank you for the question. I have consistently stated that I believe, and I dare say my colleagues at the FCC believe, that First Amendment freedoms, including the freedom of the press, are critical, that we value what broadcasters, newspapers, and others do to keep people informed, and I have consistently stood up for that value throughout my time at the Commission. And if I were ever asked by anyone in the administration to take retaliatory action, for instance, in a media regulatory proceeding, I would not do so.
Okay, so have there been any communications about the media between you, your office, and the White House that the committee should be aware of?
Senator, I've been aware of the comments that the President has made. And
Right, but has there been any communication that this committee should be aware of in light of the exchange that you've had with members of the committee during the confirmation hearing? I understand your position, and I understand that you're saying, were you to ever be asked to do anything inappropriate, you would decline to do anything inappropriate. My question is, have there been any overtures or communications, direct or indirect, that we ought to be aware of in light of the sort of unsatisfactory resolution of this issue in the first hearing?
Senator, I don't believe so, but if that ever changes, I commit to the committee and to you that I will make sure that you're informed.
Thank you. Mr. Carr, in 2014, when President Obama expressed his support for net neutrality rules, the Department of Commerce submitted an ex parte notice with the FCC officially putting the President's statement in the record. Did the White House, this White House, file an ex parte with the FCC yesterday when it announced its support for the current proceeding to unravel the open Internet order?
I personally am not aware of any filing at this time.
Is one required? As GC of the Commission, do you believe one is required?
There's sort of a reticulated standard under the ex parte rules.
A what standard?
Reticulated detailed standard in the ex parte rules. And I'd have to refresh my recollection of how those rules work and whether that would be implicated.
Can you follow up with the committee on this issue?
Happy to.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, I have no questions for you except to say thank you for your public service and your patience. Thank you to your family. What happened to you is unfair. We have to move expeditiously on your nomination. And a quick question for each of the nominees on E-rate. Hawaii is one of the nation's leaders in school broadband. Thanks to E-rate modernization, do you commit to keeping the current E-rate program intact to ensure that all of our country's students can get the connectivity that they need?
Senator, absolutely. I believe in a strong E-rate program, and that is my commitment going forward.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal is recognized.
Thanks, Senator Moran. Chairman Pai, thank you for the conversation we had yesterday. I want to pursue just very quickly the questions that my colleague, Senator Schatz, asked regarding contacts with the White House. Are you aware of any contacts or intervention by the White House in any past or pending merger, including the AT&T Time Warner merger?
Senator, I am not. No one at the White House has ever weighed in with me and indirectly with the staff, as far as I know, on any pending transaction.
Those kinds of contacts would be absolutely improper and probably illegal, correct?
Senator, I defer to others as to the legality, but I'll simply say that as the leader of an independent agency, it is our goal to be an independent actor reviewing the facts and the law as we see them, and not as others might see them.
I've been alarmed by reports, and I've written to the nominee by the Trump administration for Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, expressing my concern about those reports that indicated that the White House might try to use the merger as a way to impede or intimidate the exercise of First Amendment rights. And you would be troubled as well, I would assume.
Senator, absolutely. As I suggested to you yesterday, I'm an antitrust lawyer by training. I look at the facts and the law, and I don't allow extraneous political considerations to intrude on that inquiry.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the lawsuit brought by state attorneys general against broadband providers for advertising or offering speeds that they have failed to deliver?
I've seen press reports of one. I'm not aware if there's a class action of some sort that I should be aware of.
As a former attorney general, the allegations in the complaint certainly seem to me like fraud. They're charging customers for Internet speeds they failed to provide, which seems a little bit like theft, stealing. Would you agree?
Well, Senator, I'm not aware of those particular allegations, but obviously I believe, as we made clear last week when we took action on slamming and cramming, that a consumer should get what they pay for, and they should not have to pay for what they did not ask for.
As you know, Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act
requires the FCC to report annually on whether broadband internet is being deployed to, quote, all Americans in a responsible and timely fashion, end quote, and to take immediate action if it is not. So I would assume that it would be important to you in fulfilling that obligation, conducting that review, that companies lying to you about what the speeds they're delivering to their customers would prompt some action by the FCC, correct?
Oh, Senator, I'm not familiar with that interpretation of Section 706. Traditionally, has been focused more on deployment, but I'd be happy to take a look at that or any other legal authority that the FCC might have to vindicate consumer interests.
Would you commit to reviewing the lawsuit that's been brought by 35 states and taking action if appropriate?
Senator, absolutely. If you wouldn't mind, I will follow up with your staff and give you the answers that you need.
I want to talk briefly about the cost of wired broadband. Are prices for broadband internet going up or down?
Senator, to me, it depends on the marketplace. I think that in some places it is prohibitively expensive. In some places where there's more competition, the prices are lower. And our goal is obviously both ubiquitous access and broad competition in all markets so that every consumer has a fair chance to enjoy the benefits of the digital revolution.
I think that the FCC has a responsibility to know what's happening with broadband prices, does it not?
It does, but again, it depends on the particular marketplace. Every marketplace is different, and so overall, we want to make sure that we have rules in place that promote competition in every single jurisdiction.
Do you have an overall assessment of whether broadband prices are going up or down?
I don't currently. That's part of the reason why we've initiated a Section 706 inquiry that I've proposed to my colleagues back in June, and so that's one of the reasons why we tee that up, is to figure out what are the facts in the marketplace as of 2017. The most recent one was done a couple of years ago.
I'd like to invite comments by any of the other nominees.
Thank you for the question, Senator Blumenthal. This is purely anecdotal. In my house, the cost is going up. I believe that the agency has a responsibility to assess the deployment of broadband pursuant to Section 706, as the chairman mentioned. And I think on a going forward basis, it would be useful if price was a consideration in that assessment. I think consumers would benefit from that.
Senator, thank you for the question. I agree. I think we need to be taking full stock of the market when we're deciding whether it is competitive or not.
Thank you. My time has expired, so there are a lot of other questions, including going into this one in greater depth, and I look forward to working with you on them. Thank you.
Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to our nominees today. Chairman Pai, always great to see you, and thank you for appearing today at this nomination hearing. As we've discussed many times before, we have an orphan county issue in southwest Colorado preventing Coloradans from receiving Colorado TV, an issue that Commissioner Rosenworcel, I believe, saw firsthand during her last tenure at the Commission. While the FCC approved La Plata County's decision, southwestern Colorado, their initial market modification application, out-of-state broadcasters lodged opposition against it. And we've had back and forth comments. Now, it's my understanding the FCC record is complete and the Commission may either reaffirm or reverse their original approval decision. It's my hope that the Commission will act swiftly to make a decision on this issue, and I would just like to have your commitment that the Commission will review the La Plata County application and make a decision on review of the comments submitted.
Absolutely, Senator, I will.
Thank you. The rest of the Commissioners, if you'd like to follow up on that.
If confirmed, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Carr, we're facing a spectrum crunch in the United States as more and more consumers opt to stream video and use other intensive applications over their mobile wireless and Wi-Fi devices. The economy benefits from billions of dollars annually being invested in expanding access to commercial spectrum and seeing platforms and devices develop over the airwaves. And I think we have to have a mix of low-band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum to continue this incredible economic progress. And so, Mr. Carr, do you believe it's important for Congress to promote the benefits of establishing a spectrum pipeline to highlight the need for continuing to free up spectrum for commercial use through relocation and better coordination among incumbents?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I do. When you look at data traffic from 2010 to 2016, some estimates say it's grown 35 times over that period of time. So I think we need an all-of-the-above approach, and I think your efforts and those of Congress on a spectrum pipeline would be very welcome.
If there are other nominees would like to comment on that.
The answer is yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator.
Very good. Thank you. Chairman Pai, I want to commend the Commission for releasing a draft order on Mobility Fund Phase 2 that recognizes the existing Form 477 data is not adequate for determining accurate mobile coverage across the country. And I would hope to get your commitment at the Commission that the Commission will continue to work to ensure that mapping data used at the FCC represents an accurate account on the ground, accurate on-the-ground account of mobile coverage.
Absolutely, Senator. We're going to be voting on August 3rd on some steps that make sure that the data we take into the Commission is accurate so that our output is similarly worthy of the American people's trust.
Thank you, because obviously in the western slope of Colorado, where you have significant mountain valleys and peaks and the eastern plains where you have vast expanses of land, what appears to have cell phone coverage on a map, I can tell you the mile marker where the map is not true. Commissioner Rosenworcel, if confirmed, will you also work to ensure the Commission's mapping is accurate? Mr. Carr, both of you want to answer that?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, the United States obviously being an incredible leader in 5G technology, and I think you and Senator Moran had a discussion about that, but I would just reiterate the importance of 5G, the opportunities it poses for this country, the challenges it poses, and how we can work together to address it. So I know you've already covered that, but thank you, and I know a number of members wait to question. I'll yield back my time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Senator Fisher is next.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Thank you, Chairman Pai, for visiting Nebraska. A couple years ago, we had some good meetings with stakeholders, a couple different meetings. I understand you took a road trip recently and you bypassed our state. So we hope to get you back there soon. As you know, Senator Klobuchar and I, along with more than 50 of our Senate colleagues, sent you a letter in April, and we urged the FCC to take steps to ensure that rural consumers can purchase standalone broadband. And I want to thank you for your response and for your acknowledgement that this is a problem and it's not yet fixed. Will you commit to continue working with your colleagues and with Congress to solve this problem so that our rural consumers can have that in a timely way?
I will, Senator, absolutely.
And I would ask Commissioner Rosenworcel, same question.
If confirmed, yes.
And Mr. Carr.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, in Nebraska, we have several counties that are considered orphan counties, and Senator Gardner just spoke about some of them, and that means they're in a designated market area for a state that other than Nebraska, and I think it's 26 of our counties out of 93 that are affected by this. In 2015, following the direction set by Congress in the satellite reauthorization bill, the FCC adopted rules to make it easier for people living in those orphan counties to access in-state programming. And while these modifications are a good step, I still am concerned that they really are too burdensome, and they're really complicated for small communities to be able to undertake those. What's your opinion of them?
Senator, we want to make the process easier, and that's part of the reason why we've adopted some reforms. If there are others that are worth considering, please let us know, and we would be happy to take that into account, so long as the constituents you're referring to are not Denver Bronco fans.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, there's just a minute. We have, Western Nebraska. We don't have sports, pro sports team. In Nebraska, we're all Husker fans. So I'll clarify that for you. The FCC, though, are there any actions that you can take proactively that would be helpful?
I think part of it involves making sure that we process these applications efficiently. Part of it is also encouraging others who might be stakeholders, local governmental entities, for instance, or individual consumers, to be able to put into place any of the facts that they think are necessary for us to make an informed judgment. And for them to be able to tell us, look, we want to hear what the local weather is in western Nebraska, but we're getting information from outside the state. That's not relevant to us. That's very helpful to us because the core value of the entire broadcast business, after all, is localism. And that's one of the things that I think is important for constituents in western Nebraska, around the country, to know that when they tune on TV, they'll be able to get information that is relevant to them.
I would be interested in visiting with you more about options that you believe the Commission would take, and with the other commissioners as well, or if you believe there are actions that Congress should take in order to have that localism truly be effective. And Commissioner Rosenworcel, I'm sure that you recall that as he was about to end his term, Chairman Wheeler asked the FCC's Wireless Bureau to initiate an 11th-hour investigation of whether certain carriers' zero-rating services violated the net neutrality rules. And I was glad when Chairman Pai rescinded that report and stated that the FCC would not focus on denying Americans free data. And these plans are very popular, and they provide innovative benefits to consumers. I also find it concerning that Chairman Wheeler issued a report on his way out the door after Congress had already requested that he refrain from issuing controversial items after the 2016 election. So, Commissioner, what is your view of zero-rating services? Do you believe that they provide a tangible consumer benefit, or do you believe, or do you agree with Chairman Wheeler's report?
Thank you for the question, Senator. To be clear, I believe that that investigation and those reports were issued after my departure from the agency. I understand that with zero net rating, there is the possibility of free services, and I understand the allure of free services for some consumers. But I also think, at its extremes, some types of zero net rating can undermine network neutrality, and that leads me to be concerned. I think it's an area that merits more study, but to be candid with you, I do have concerns.
Thank you. Mr. Carr, do you have any comments on that?
Thank you, Senator. I think, as an agency, the FCC should be trying to promote competition, innovation that includes across different types of service plans and pricing plans. So I think we need to promote those types of innovations.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to our nominees, thank you for your willingness to serve the public in this very important position. Thank you for being here today. Ms. Rosenworcel, I certainly appreciate your strong commitment as a commissioner to maintaining a free, open, and fair Internet. If confirmed, I hope that you're going to continue with this commitment to broadband Internet as an essential tool for millions of Americans and also for small businesses and fast-growing startups in Michigan as well as all across the country. Allowing established corporations to prioritize their services or slow down their competitors, I believe, would put these small businesses at a competitive disadvantage and could very well stifle innovation that's so important for our country. Would you agree that net neutrality under FCC's 2015 Open Internet rules helps level the playing field for small businesses and startups, allowing them to compete fairly against large established players?
Yes, Senator, I agree.
Great, thank you. Chairman Pai, an issue that I've talked about many times, including with you yesterday in my office, appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you, is the 5.9 gigahertz band, which is vitally important to automotive safety systems, which will dramatically decrease highway deaths when fully deployed, given the fact that we have over nearly 40,000 people dying on our highways every year. This will be truly life-saving technologies deployed by auto companies. And for the past 2 years, this committee has engaged with the FCC, the Department of Transportation, NTIA, as agencies conduct joint testing of 2 proposals for the 5.9 spectrum sharing. Your commitment, I certainly appreciate our meeting again, and your commitment to keep the members of this committee informed of any developments on the 5.9 docket, I think is extremely important to ensure that any decision made for spectrum sharing are based on data that is both rigorous as well as fully transparent. So could you please provide this committee a status update as to where the testing process is now and the timeline for making any decisions in that area, please?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and I appreciate your concern, and I'm grateful to the courtesies you extended to me yesterday as well. As you know, this is an area where testing has been exceptionally important. In January, a new round of testing began, and it became clear that supplemental testing was appropriate. The agency targeted 9 different devices that I believe are currently being evaluated at the lab, the FCC lab in Columbia. We are studying the variety of data points that are coming out of those tests, and we haven't yet reached the point where we can draw any definitive conclusions, but and therefore I can't give you a specific time frame, but if and when that testing does conclude, we will keep the committee apprised, and in particular you, because I know you have a great interest in this issue.
Well, I appreciate that. And also, just a follow-up question, how would you characterize the coordination that you're seeing between those three agencies? And have you run into any roadblocks or in that coordination? And there's anything that these agencies or players that can do that would allow for a more transparent and smooth process in your mind?
Thank you for the question. I think thus far we have worked very cooperatively with our sister agencies on this issue, as in many other issues, and so we're all trying to figure out the best answer here. And so thus far, at least, it's been a very fruitful and productive relationship.
Great. Also, to follow up again, Chairman, I understand that one of your biggest priorities at the FCC is expanding broadband coverage, closing the digital divide. We had a long discussion about that yesterday. And as you know, one of the most important aspects of this is accurate data collection, as we've heard from Senator Gardner, as well as I think Senator Fisher brought up the issue as well, so that we can understand which areas truly have Internet access and target our efforts to those that do not. And I know you've been working on this through the Mobility Fund Phase 2 in the Form 477 reform process. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the Rural Wireless Act of 2017 with both Senator Manchin and Senator Wicker. Appreciate Senator Wicker's leadership on this issue, which would require the FCC to maintain more up-to-date and accurate data on wireless coverage, particularly in rural areas. But the legislation will also direct the FCC to establish methodology within 6 months to improve the validity and reliability of wireless coverage data and to ensure that coverage data is collected in a consistent, robust, and efficient way. I'd like to hear more about your plan to reform Form 477 data, and particularly would your plan contribute to the type of methodology that we have outlined in our bill?
Appreciate that perspective, Senator. So with respect to Mobility Fund Phase 2, obviously we are not relying on the Form 477 data as such, given some of the concerns that have been expressed. We have a tailor-made, so to speak, data collection to ensure that we are able to proceed with that Mobility Fund auction in a timely way while we consider the broader issues relating to Form 477. With respect to Form 477, we have undertaken a comprehensive review, and at a high level, essentially, the goal here is to make sure that the agency has a very clear picture of where coverage is and where it is not, because the substantial distorting effects that can result from us operating on the basis of bad data are tremendous. I mean, obviously, we're diverting subsidies to areas that might not need the help. We are disincentivizing companies from building out in areas that are unserved. And if you're in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or in Detroit, you need to be able to have coverage if the FCC says, according to its data, you have coverage. And so be happy to work with you on that effort, and I certainly commend you for your work on that legislation, which would help us establish some of these standards along the way.
Great. Appreciate it. Appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Next up is, I'm sorry, Senator Peters. Next up is Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome. And thank you for your willingness to serve, and thank you for the opportunity to meet with all of you, and welcome to your family. Very exciting day for all of you. I will have to say I am a little partial to Mr. Carr because his wife is a native Nevadan, I found out. It's fantastic. Mrs. Rosenworcel, let me start with you. In the conversation we had, as you well know, we talked a little bit about the intersection of innovation and transportation, which obviously is of interest not just to me, but to the state of Nevada as well. Where do you see the constructive place for the FCC to work toward the safe and reliable advancement of autonomous connected vehicles, unmanned aircrafts, and smart communities?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Lots of interesting things are happening with drones and with autonomous vehicles. A lot of them involve tests, and those tests are going to require spectrum. I think the FCC should develop Part 5 experimental license practices that make those tests easier for industries, research institutions, and universities. We can do a lot more with these new facilities, and if we can test them and have the spectrum necessary to facilitate those tests and then get those services in the marketplace.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the comments with respect to E-rate. I hear this in Nevada as well. Not only did 5 of our school superintendents come to visit me here, but I've had the opportunity to sit down with our public libraries, and it is a benefit not just to our urban but our rural communities in connecting many people that would not have access to education, to information that is necessary for workforce development applications, so many things. So I'm a big supporter. So thank you for those comments. Mr. Carr, when we were together, we talked a little bit about the concern about cybersecurity and what we need to do in this space. In the last FCC hearing, I had asked Commissioner O'Reilly about FCC's place in the challenging cybersecurity sphere, including the Commission's Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division that works with the communications industry to develop and implement improvements that help ensure the reliability, redundancy, and security of the nation's communications infrastructure. What specifically can the FCC be doing to aid in the concern and challenge of cybersecurity?
Senator, thank you for the question. Cybersecurity is an important issue, whether it's IoT or just traditional networks. The FCC, as you note, has a group called CISRIC that works to develop best practices that the agency can help push into the marketplace. The FCC also has network-based expertise, and in this space, DHS is considered the sector-specific agency in charge of communications in this area. And so I think we should be taking our network-based expertise and experts, working with the DHS and trying to consolidate the efforts there so we don't have an alphabet soup of agencies potentially working at cross purposes in the area of cyber.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. And then Commissioner Pai, a couple of questions for you, but let me follow up with one that Senator Blumenthal started with. And just for clarification, as you sit here today, you are not aware that U.S. Telecom and NCTA have asked the FCC for a ruling confirming ISPs are following federal transparency rules by posting online their average performance during times of peak usage. Is that correct?
Oh, Senator, I'm sorry. I thought Senator Blumenthal was referring to a lawsuit brought by state attorneys general. I wasn't aware of that particular lawsuit that he was referring to.
Okay. Are you aware that U.S. Telecom and NCTA have asked the FCC for a ruling confirming the ISP's role there?
Yes, I am aware of that.
Okay. So I am aware that the various AGs are concerned that that industry petition to the FCC on cost transparency represents nothing more than the industry's effort to shield itself from state law enforcement. What is the current status of the ruling, and can you speak to your perspective on whether this is fair consumer protection issue to be concerned about?
Thank you, Senator. We are actively studying that issue. We haven't made any determinations yet. We've obviously been focused on a lot of things at the Commission, but I can assure you and assure the committee that we'll keep you posted before any decision is made, and we'll make sure that we take the appropriate steps to keep you up to date.
Is there a timeline that you can give us?
We have no particular timeline on that petition.
Okay. Thank you. And then I appreciate your response to my QFR from the last FCC hearing when we were talking a little bit about federal siting for telecom services on public and tribal lands.
Yeah.
In the QFR, you mentioned that your Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee would be providing recommendations on how to reduce or eliminate barriers. You also noted your intention to invite federal representatives from key agencies such as the Department of Interior to participate. When can we expect to see the recommendations, and will they be made public?
They will be made public, Senator. The working groups of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee have been very actively working. We don't have a specific time frame on when they're going to report back to us, but the general ask I gave of them when I initiated the first meeting was to give us a sense of, with respect to the model state code and the model local codes for deployment, at least by the end of the year, sometime by the fall, ideally, if they could give us some preliminary recommendations at least on where we could move productively there. On the other recommendations, they haven't given us a time frame. They're obviously working really hard, and we want to encourage that in a full and transparent way without pushing them before they're ready to make a decision.
Thank you. And I notice my time is up. Thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carr, are you aware that in the United States of America, of all the human beings on the planet Earth, 1/3 of the incarcerated women are, all the incarcerated women on the planet Earth, that 1/3 of them are in American prisons?
I was not previously aware of that statistic.
Okay. Are you aware that the majority of them are parents of children under 18?
I am now.
Okay. Are you aware that that these women don't get adequate sanitary products and often have to scrape together dollars to buy tampons and pads? Are you aware of that, sir?
Senator, I am now, yes.
So, do you know that social science data that women who are able and empowered to communicate with their children, that it benefits society in multiple ways. Lowers recidivism rates, lowers the rates of those children themselves being disciplined at school, lowers the rates at which those children are expelled from school, lowers the rates in which those children are incarcerated themselves. Do you know that?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, so help me understand how in the United States of America, have you been to a female prison, sir?
I've been to a number of prisons.
Have you been to a female prison, sir?
No, I don't believe I have.
Have you sat with formerly incarcerated women?
I can't recall.
You can't recall if you've sat down with women who have been incarcerated to listen to their experiences in prison?
I can certainly say I've never sat down where that has been a topic of discussion.
Okay, well, I have, sir. And when you hear that women have to make incredibly difficult decisions, whether they buy tampons or call their kids at home because of the usury rates with which these charges they face just trying to communicate with their children. So can you help me understand what the logic is behind the FCC abandoning its defense of capping the cost of these calls, which often are dollars for minutes? Help me understand that decision.
Senator, thank you for the question, and thank you for your advocacy on this issue. It's a critically important one, as you pointed out. There is a market failure when it comes to the rates and the services for inmate call-in. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The question is, how do we go about solving that? The FCC, through a number of good faith efforts, 2013, 2015, 2016, took steps to try to address it. Unfortunately, when those decisions were appealed to the courts, the D.C. Circuit on 4 separate occasions entered stays, finding it was more likely than not that the FCC's decision was unlawful. So to your question, when the administration turned over and there was one piece of one of those appeals that was coming up quickly on oral argument, there was a majority at the FCC that did not support the FCC's position there. So the question was, do we abandon the appeal altogether, or do we try to work to see what portions of that decision we can cobble a majority together to defend and then go to the court and strenuously defend them? I'm glad that it was that latter choice that we did, and the court's decision ultimately did uphold the FCC's jurisdiction to cap interstate rates and some of the significant reforms it did with ancillary fees. There is certainly more work to be done here, and I would commit to you to working with you, your staff, to find lawful ways that we can address this issue.
But we abandon our defense of the authority of the FCC to cap intrastate prison calling rates.
That's correct.
And your feelings on that abandonment?
I wish that we had the authority to do it. It's a problem. The Communications Act, as set up by Congress, did not, in my judgment, give the FCC authority to take that step. But I would welcome specific grants of authority that would give the FCC the jurisdiction to act here.
Well, I patently disagree with you about the authority of the FCC, the urgency of the problem, and the harm that failure to defend has caused. I have other questions, Mr. Chairman, but unfortunately my time has expired, and out of respect for my fellow colleagues, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Udall's up next.
Chairman Thune, thank you very, very much. Chairman Pai, the last time you were before this committee, you were hesitant to answer direct questions about the President's attacks against FCC-regulated media companies that have reported stories critical of the administration. And I appreciate that you were more clear and direct in your written responses on March the 17th. However, President Trump has continued his unprecedented and dangerous attacks on media organizations that report stories he does not like. On June 28th, President Trump tweeted, and I quote here, "The Amazon Washington Post, sometimes referred to as the Guardian of Amazon, not paying Internet taxes, in paren, which they should, in paren, is fake news." Many people viewed this tweet as a threat by the President of the United States to pursue higher taxes against a company in retaliation for negative news coverage, and I believe that's outrageous. On July 5th, the New York Times reported this about the White House and CNN, and I quote here, "White House advisors have discussed a potential point of leverage over their adversary, A senior administration official said a pending merger between CNN's parent company, Time Warner, and AT&T, end quote. Consistent with this reporting, the President himself was clear on this topic in an October 2016 speech, just before the election. I quote then candidate Trump. As an example, this is a quote, direct, as an example of the power structure I'm fighting, AT&T is buying Time Warner and thus CNN, a deal we will not approve in my administration because it's too much concentration of power in the hands of too few, end quote. Speaking of concentration of power, there is another major media merger pending before the FCC, the proposed acquisition of the Tribune Company by Sinclair Broadcasting. There are real concerns that this merger would violate media ownership rules, but the FCC has already helped pave the way for this merger by reinstating the so-called UHF discount that enables TV companies to get bigger. Sinclair now requires all their local stations to air video commentary pieces by a former Trump administration staffer who generally supports the Trump administration. Sinclair's CEO has also been quite complimentary of you personally. The contrasting approach here creates the very real perception that the Trump administration would act to reward friendly coverage and punish negative coverage. So in light of the developments since March, I would like to seek renewed answers from you on two questions I posed in March. First, will you reassure us that you will exercise your authority as chairman of the FCC to regulate the media in an impartial manner?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. Have you had any communications with the White House directly or through an intermediary regarding any media regulatory issues since March?
Senator, I have not directly had any conversations with anyone in the administration with respect to media regulatory proceedings. To the best of my knowledge, no one on my staff or in the FCC has indirectly had any such conversations as well.
Thank you. Finally, do you believe it is appropriate for any federal official with power over media organizations to attack or threaten them with legal or regulatory retaliation over negative news coverage, media coverage?
Senator, I certainly have never done so, and I commit to you that I will not do so, so long as I have the privilege of serving at the agency.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to follow up with Mr. Carr and Ms. Rosenworcel. Mr. Pai responded on March 17th to a letter from every Democratic member of this committee that posed 6 questions along these lines. Will you both commit to answer these same 6 questions for the record prior to a committee vote on your nominations?
Yes, Senator.
Mr. Carr?
Yes, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take this opportunity to note that Senator Hassan and I have requested a hearing in this committee on the current state of the U.S. media landscape. We've not had a hearing on that topic in over 8 years, and I think it's a very timely one, and I hope you could reconsider that. One quick question here, and this should be quick because I think it's a yes or no. Recently, there's been a spike in violence and intimidation against individual journalists. A Republican congressman famously body-slammed Ben Jacobs, a reporter for The Guardian, after being asked about his position on the House health care bill one day before his special election. A West Virginia reporter was arrested while asking HHS Secretary Price about the health care bill as well. Trump White House staff reportedly have threatened to keep files of dirt on White House reporters. FCC security also manhandled CQ reporter John Donnelly and pinned him against a wall after he sought to ask questions of Commissioner O'Reilly. Will each of you commit to speak out against violence and intimidation against reporters and commit that you personally will set a good example for press access in your own public activities?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. What I'm going to do, I'm going to intend to stay through an entire, at least first round for everybody, but Senator Wicker does have to go. I'm going to recognize him next, and then we'll continue to move down the list that we have here. So, Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Pai, as you know, accelerating broadband development in rural areas is a priority for many members on both sides of the dais. I've worked closely with you and the Commission to ensure that the agency's data collection methods regarding mobile broadband coverage are standardized. Standardized data is necessary to ensure that funds used to expand broadband deployment are targeted to truly underserved and unserved communities in rural America and in my state of Mississippi. Would you agree that standardizing data collection is important to target funds accurately to deploy the broadband in underserved and unserved areas? And will you commit to ensuring that the baseline coverage data collected from carriers for the Mobility Fund Phase 2 challenge process be standardized? And please discuss how the draft order circulated last week on the Mobility Fund challenge process achieves that objective.
Thank you, Senator. And this is one of the reasons why we broke with longstanding practice in my second week in office and instituted a policy of publishing every single proposal in order that the FCC was considering at least 3 weeks in advance. Nowhere is the thicket more complicated than this one. We want to make sure that we get it right for Americans' wireless consumers, and that requires us getting the data right. And so last week, as you pointed out, we published the proposal that we're going to be voting on August 3rd to ensure that this data is accurate. And I understand that standardized data collection is one of the issues that has been flagged. We would love to work with you and your staff, any interested stakeholders, frankly, to make sure that on August 3rd we ensure that we have a process that makes the input accurate so that the output can be worthy.
Will this be a one-time data collection?
With respect to Mobility Fund Phase 2, currently that is our expectation, but obviously we are always open to suggestions on ways to improve our overall data collection or to broaden
well,
this one if necessary.
Well, I'd like to mention to all three of you then that there is a serious question as to how the Mobility Fund Challenge process will ensure that recipients of the funds are meeting build-out commitments over the 10-year period. Would you like to comment on that?
I'd be happy to, Senator. Every dollar that is spent by the FCC that is ultimately collected from the taxpayers has to be deployed. It cannot be simply poured down the drain, and that requires build-out. And so we have instituted aggressive reporting obligations and build-out obligations as well to ensure that that money actually goes to building out 4G LTE in unserved parts of the country. We do not want that money to be wasted. America's wireless consumers simply don't have time to wait.
Let's have a further discussion on that with members of the Commission. While the draft order specifies that cell edge probability and the cell loading factor will be used by carriers when creating rural coverage maps, some people remain concerned that additional factors such as the assumed signal strength also need to be standardized or disclosed in order for the data you receive to be reliable. Will you commit to working with me and those stakeholders to address these concerns before the order is finalized?
I would be happy to, Senator.
Thank you, and I look forward to you briefing me and my staff on about your efforts in this regard.
Thank you.
Now let's talk about the federal permitting process. And I'll go back to you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the FCC is working on a proceeding to modernize the Commission's approach to the National Environmental Protection Act and the National Historic Protection Act to accelerate the deployment of wireless infrastructure. There are many onerous rules in place today that prevent or delay deployment, including the implementation of antenna sites that are critical to wireless network build-out. Please discuss how an update to the Commission's approach towards environmental and historic reviews may accelerate the deployment of mobile broadband and the proliferation of 5G networks to both urban and rural areas, particularly in existing public right-of-ways that have already undergone environmental and historic reviews where broadband infrastructure has already been deployed. And do you think Congress needs to act on this issue?
All great points. Obviously, the regulatory review, including environmental and historic preservation review that applied traditionally to 100-foot cell towers, may not be as relevant when you're talking about a small cell that could be as small as a pizza box or that you could hold in your hand. And so we want to make sure for these less obtrusive, lower power deployments, that we tailor the regulatory burden to the nature of the deployment, as Commissioner Rosenworcel has pointed out. And so that's one of the things we're looking to work with all interested stakeholders on, to figure out what is the appropriate calibration of those rules with respect to small cells and distributed antenna systems and the like. In terms of additional authority, it may be helpful in some cases for Congress to give us that authority with respect to 5G. For example, the FCC's jurisdiction over pole attachments is somewhat circumscribed, and so we'd be happy to work with you, any members of the committee who are interested, to find creative solutions that would help us secure the benefits of the wireless revolution to come.
Mr. Carr, do you think Congress needs to act in this space, or do you have the authority you need?
Senator, thank you for the question. There are certainly some actions the FCC can take in terms of streamlining. Congress's help here would certainly be welcome, whether it's dig once legislation or work with respect to federal lands where the FCC might have more limited authority.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. I wanted to ask Chairman Pai, we had a town hall on net neutrality, and I know the chairman mentioned comments that may be, artificial and coming into the FCC in regards to the possible change to net neutrality laws. I know that that's not, my constituents had very real stories. And we have a very big internet economy and app economy, and want to continue to grow that with a very high concentration of software engineers in great schools like the University of Washington. So I hope that you will be pulling out of that kind of data entered into the FCC real examination of business models and challenges that any change, and obviously we're against any change to this rule at this point in time, that you are really going to look at the details that individual businesses and consumers in my state are filing with the FCC as it relates to this, and not just push out saying, oh, it was just a bunch of bots or a bunch of Russians.
We definitely will, Senator. And when I say we will make a full and fair review of the record, that means exactly that we don't exclude points of view for any ideological or political reasons. We take an accurate assessment of what is in the record. That includes the perspectives from startups and consumers of the types who made their voices heard at the town hall that you held.
Thank you. Well, we certainly hope you will do that, because it's very, very important to us that we continue that economy. Secondly, when I look at this issue in general about cybersecurity and the FCC, and I look at the numbers, Department of Homeland Statistics, of 209 cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in 2016, a big increase. Don't you think that the FCC should be doing more to look at the communication risks of the communication sector specifically, not just advocating that to Homeland Security? We're certainly pushing legislation here on the critical infrastructure side with the DOE to make sure, like on pipelines and electricity grid, but why not you take more responsibility at your post in looking at the potential hacking and cybersecurity risks of our communications systems?
Senator, this is a critical issue, and in this capacity, as chairman, I have had the ability to be briefed in a classified setting in a secure facility of the FCC on these issues. I can assure you that I take a firsthand appreciation of how serious it is. At the end of the day, we are guided by the rule of law, and Congress has, for better or worse, given us relatively circumscribed authority in this area. Within the limits of that authority, I've certainly tried to engage as best we can with our sister agencies to provide them information about some of the threats to the networks that we see, to keep myself apprised on some of the threats as they materialize. If Congress gives us additional authority, I can assure you that I would faithfully administer it to ensure that businesses and consumers everywhere are protected.
Ms. Rosenworcel, is there more that we could be doing at the FCC now and giving direction to the communication industry on security?
Yes, Senator. The very first sentence of the Communications Act speaks about the use of communications for the safety and life and property. I think Congress was very clear that they intended the FCC to have a role, so I would disagree with my past colleague sitting here to the right.
Well, I'm just, maybe this is something for the future, since we did have, Mr. Chairman, a good cybersecurity hearing earlier in the year. I just think that everyone's devices, now that everything's networked, now that everything's together, they are the entry point, obviously, and I'm very concerned after the Washington Post issued this story about how the Russian government hacking of our energy infrastructure at a nuclear power plant. I just thinking it's time to take all of this serious, as so many devices are the most vulnerable entry point to a network that now is controlled by people in remote situations. So hopefully we could follow on our last cyber hearing and get more input. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, and that is an issue that I think will be an ongoing concern for this committee and for all the people across this country. Yeah. Next up is Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Recently in Wisconsin, I held roundtables on rural broadband access in 2 communities, Eagle River in Vilas County, which is near the northern border in our state with the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and Monticello, which is in Greene County near the Illinois border, southern border of our state. And they're very diverse communities, but there were certainly some very similar themes that I heard in both communities about their lack of broadband access and how it harms their economic development, how it affects their ability to attract new families to live there or vacation there, how it affects local health care providers to fully utilize the promise of health IT and electronic medical records, an example of which is in Greene County, the southern county I visited. The local hospital does have a sophisticated health IT system, but patients can't access their electronic medical records at home without access to broadband, or do something simple like uploading a photo of a healing wound to avoid a travel to a clinic or a hospital if there's no need. And so these were themes I know you're well familiar with. I also heard intense frustration of those people on the ground who just want to fix this problem, who want to deploy the fiber or whatever means. The disconnect between the needs of these communities and the federal programs that they know exist to help get broadband to places like theirs. And so I know, Mr. Carr, we talked a little bit about this in our earlier meeting. How would you respond to the folks of Eagle River or Monticello, Wisconsin, who ask, what is the FCC going to do to make sure that people like them have access to this critical resource?
Thank you, Senator, for the question and for your advocacy on these important issues. There is a lot that the FCC can and should be doing. One is we need to reduce the cost of getting services, networks out to these parts of the country. The agency right now has some infrastructure proceedings that are teed up on that. Spectrum is going to be a key resource as well. There's more we can be doing to push spectrum out into the marketplace. And then obviously at the end of the day, universal service support is going to be critical to many parts of the country. We need to be making sure that we're targeting those funds to these areas that need it.
I want to continue to focus on rural broadband deployment and mention, and this is for the whole panel, sort of a two-part question. One is, there's been some confusion or at least lack of clarity as to whether the President's infrastructure proposal would include broadband or not. His initial proposal that was unveiled did not mention broadband, but it was reported that last month in Iowa, he told an audience there that broadband would absolutely be a part of his $1 trillion package. Because I'm concerned about the lack of clarity, I guess we'll start with you, Mr. Carr, and then Ms. Rosenworcel, and then Mr. Pai. I want to know where you stand with regard to whether broadband should be a part of this infrastructure program. But the follow-up question is, if we indeed successfully advocate for these resources in an infrastructure package, would you advocate for those resources to be deployed through existing FCC programs, through a new FCC programs, or programs outside of the FCC's orbit? Mr. Carr, why don't we start with you and then
Sure.
Ms.
Senator,
Rosenworcel.
thank you for the question. Obviously, with the usual caveat that I defer to Congress and the administration in working out how to put together an infrastructure package. I believe the Secretary of Transportation has recently also said that she believes that broadband should be part of it. I think that would be a good idea. The FCC does have an existing mechanism, USF, that could be one potential avenue for distributing those funds.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. This may come as no surprise, but the administration has not spoken to me about exactly what is going to be in that infrastructure proposal with respect to rural broadband, so I have no special knowledge about it. But I do know this, that if we wind up having additional programs for broadband, whether it's at the FCC or somewhere else, we need to make sure that the right hand and the left hand are talking to one another. We have had many programs in the past at the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture, in addition to the FCC, and the one thing I have been struck by is the lack of conversation about how those programs work together.
Senator, in March, in my first major speech as chairman, I said that if there were to be an infrastructure plan, I would urge strongly that digital infrastructure, that broadband be a part of it. And I also urged, with respect to your second question in that same speech, that those funds be channeled into the FCC's existing mechanisms, which are tried and true. We have measures to promote fiscal responsibility and accountability. And at the end of the day, if you approve that package, then you can go to your constituents and say the tax dollars that you've sent to the FCC were wisely spent. I would also add, with respect to coordination, there's a rural prosperity working group that I'm privileged to be a part of. It's convened by the Secretary of Agriculture, and so I've spoken to him, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and others, to figure out ways to synthesize our efforts so that it's not a bunch of cooks in the cooking a bunch of different meals. We're all focused on the one prize here, which is delivering rural broadband in a consistent and clear way.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, especially for allowing this hearing to go on this long so we all get a chance to ask questions. I really appreciate it. I also really appreciate the three of you. Congratulations on your nominations, and also congratulations to your family, and particularly an incredibly well-behaved group of children who are sitting through this hearing. So
well, I don't see mine, so just
you know, everybody has their tolerances, but I think they're all doing extremely well. I wanted to touch for just a minute on a topic that Senator Udall raised, and I think others have as too. Obviously, there is a link between the strength of our democracy and a free press. And the First Amendment in our Constitution enshrines this national value by guaranteeing freedoms for the press and guards against censorship. And I share many of my colleagues' concern that this administration has very little regard for this value. To Senator Udall's point, he and I have asked for a hearing kind of on the state of the media and press since there hasn't been a hearing on this issue since I think it's about 2009. Because of the hostility we're seeing directed at the free press, and because of the increase in consolidation and the prospect of even more. So I'll reiterate that request as well. But my question for each of you is, if confirmed, will you commit to upholding the values of the United States Constitution throughout your duties, including those shrined in the First Amendment protecting the free press? Mr. Pai.
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back to the E-rate program, and Ms. Rosenworcel, you have really worked diligently on these policies, and I really enjoyed our conversation about your work to help close the so-called homework gap. I am really grateful for your efforts because you're really working to ensure that all across the country our students have access to quality broadband so that they can complete their studies and ultimately compete in a global marketplace. When I was governor, I started the New Hampshire School Connectivity Initiative, a cross-agency partnership to bring high-speed internet access to all of our schools. Since that initiative began in 2015, more than 25,000 of our students have received broadband access at school. The program would not be possible without E-rate. I'm really pleased that the current governor of New Hampshire has continued my administration's initiatives on broadband, including following through with setting aside state matching funds for the proposal for broadband. In order to truly reap the educational benefits of a connected classroom, we are seeing more and more that simply having connection is not enough, right? We need greater broadband speeds and higher capacity to meet the needs of our students. Fiber certainly holds a promise for connecting in this regard. But we are still in a situation in my state, the Granite State, where nearly 16% of our schools lack service providers who will be able to build out fiber connections for them. So what is your response to these communities, and how can we help them succeed in getting access to fiber? Will E-rate continue to be a top priority for you? I've heard from Chairman Pai it will be from him, but just how can we help these folks who still don't have the level of connectivity we need to really help those students succeed?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. E-rate is absolutely vital. It is the best tool we have to reach every school and every student in this country with the broadband they need for modern education. To the extent that the program hasn't reached some corners of New Hampshire, that is something that certainly I would be happy to talk to you about. I think it has that potential. Reforms were put in place in 2015, and promises were made to every school and library in this country that E-rate dollars would be available to them, and I want to make sure that that promise is kept.
Thank you very much. To Chairman Pai and Ms. Rosenworcel, I applaud your efforts, truly a bipartisan initiative to advance balanced spectrum policy, which is clearly hard to say fast, in the United States. With the rapid expansion of wireless-dependent services woven into our daily lives, which many of us have referenced, we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to avoid a spectrum crunch and provide greater access to this fundamental finite resource. New Hampshire is a home to many innovators, entrepreneurs, creative businesses, as well as companies that provide manufacturing support for the Internet of Things. Identifying licensed and unlicensed spectrum for greater use will not only ensure that we have the reliable services we are accustomed to, but it will also spur innovation and create new market opportunities for our economy to thrive. So I realize that my time is about to expire, but Commissioner Rosenworcel, can you discuss the role of unlicensed spectrum in providing services to Americans, as well as fostering wide-scale wireless innovation? And Chairman Pai, just briefly, with the emerging prevalence of the Internet of Things and driverless cars, et cetera, do you believe we're postured to meet the increasing demand given current policies for unlicensed spectrum? So Ms. Rosenworcel and then Chairman.
Thank you for the question. If you have ever used a television remote control or a garage door opener or gone on Wi-Fi, you have used unlicensed spectrum. It powers our lives. And as we connect more things, more people, more places, and more devices, we are going to need more of it because unlicensed spectrum has low barriers to entry, and that means it's where innovation can happen, and innovation without permission. And I think a good spectrum and wireless economy requires both licensed spectrum and unlicensed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, I agree with Commissioner Rosenworcel, and I think one of the great things about our unlicensed economy is that our innovators exemplify the spirit that Winston Churchill brought to the table in 1941 when he said, urging for the U.S. to give them more material to fight the war. Give us the tools and we will finish the job. If we give these unlicensed innovators wide swaths of spectrum, low, mid, and high band, there's no telling what kinds of innovations they may be able to pioneer, and we want our American innovators to be at the forefront of that. And so that's one area where, as I mentioned earlier in response to a question to Senator Moran, I believe that the FCC has spoken with unified voice, and hopefully with Congress's support, we'll be able to continue to do that going forward.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me go so far over time.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you. I'm thinking I'm the last person here to ask questions, and so Senator Thune can go off to the White House. One more, okay. All right, so I know that many of my colleagues have asked about net neutrality, so I will simply say that this is very important to our country and innovation and everything else. Second thing that's very important is broadband deployment. And as you know, I've worked very hard on this Dig Once policy, and Senator Fisher and I and others have been pushing on universal service funding and trying to figure out how we can get more funding into rural areas. And I know we did some standalone work here, and the FCC came up with a compromise position. But it still is an issue, as you know, in rural areas deployment. And I just wondered if I could get each of your thoughts about what you think we could do on this end and what you could do on your end to really get this moving so that we don't have this digital divide, which is getting tougher and tougher for rural states. Mr. Pai.
It's so important, Senator. Thank you for your interest in this issue. And I've seen these challenges for myself, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, when I helped lay some fiber in Minneapolis, and I held a roundtable in Medelia, where some rural broadband companies talked about some of these challenges. I think there are a lot of tools in the toolbox that Congress could give the FCC. I have publicly endorsed Senator Capito and Senator Coon's Gigabit Opportunities Act, which would provide tax incentives to internet service providers to provide some of those digital connections in hard-to-serve rural and urban locations alike. I also think it would be helpful for Dig Once and other similar policies to be the law of the land. It would be helpful for the FCC to have additional authority over things like pole attachments, so some of those critical cost elements that go into building a broadband network. In the meantime, I can assure you that, as my colleagues have pointed out during this hearing, that we are committed to using every tool in the toolbox that we currently have to make that deployment proposition an easy one, whether it's making wireless infrastructure siting easier, promoting more competition in urban areas, where this is front and center for us, as I imagine it is for you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Rosenworcel?
Sure. The agency working with local jurisdictions should try to come up with a model code, one that includes policies like Dig Once and has a series of shot clocks for response. And then, hopefully, with that model code, the agency can build into its policies incentives for communities to adopt it. And if it does that, I think that could help expedite deployment nationwide.
Thank you. And of course, getting some funding on our end with the infrastructure bill would be also
always
helpful. Mr. Carr?
Thank you, Senator. I agree with many of the points that have been made. I think your Dig Once work would be very helpful. As you know, the cost of adding conduit on the front end is relatively small compared to the cost of trying to dig up the streets and deploy it down the road. I think that would be helpful. There's other steps that the agency has teed up on the infrastructure side to help streamline that. And then, of course, on the USF side, continuing to target our subsidies to the right places.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And you and I talked about rural call completion. What do you think we could do to get even more transparency to get the better completion rates?
Thank you, Senator. It's an important issue. Rural call completion has been an issue for a number of years. The FCC has recently began a proceeding to see how they can potentially take more action to fix that. I know there's some legislation that's been introduced as well that might get at intermediary providers that could also help make sure that those calls are always going through.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Rosenworcel, I worked with Senator Thune on the Rural Health Care Connectivity Act to make skilled nursing facilities eligible for funding through the Universal Service Fund's Rural Health Care Program. The bill was signed into law last year, and the $400 million cap on the program was exceeded for the 2016 funding year. And I'm concerned that the current funding shortfall could cut off vital telemedicine services. How can the FCC address the funding needs of rural health care facilities providing vital telemedicine services?
Thank you for the question. The agency's rural health care program has historically been undersubscribed, but a few years ago was adjusted and new opportunities were made available, including skilled nursing. And as a result of that success, demand has increased considerably. So now the agency going forward is going to have to wrestle with how to prioritize that demand. For my part, I don't think it should be the first application in the door, but we should put some priority on truly rural areas because I think that's what Congress intended when it laid down this law.
All right. Thank you very much. I have a few other questions I'll ask on the record, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar, and a very good piece of legislation, I might add. So, next up is Senator Duckworth.
Thank you. I want to thank the chair and ranking member for convening today's hearing, and I want to thank the nominees for participating in this important conversation. Chairman Pai, I want to thank you for offering to meet with me yesterday, but as you can tell, I had a really terrible cold, and yesterday I sounded like Chewbacca. We would not have had a good conversation. I'm hoping I head into Kathleen Turner territory here soon, but I'm transitioning. Chairman Pai, last month, a federal court struck down regulations that cap the soaring cost of phone calls made by prison inmates. And I know that my colleague, Senator Booker, has asked a question about this as well. In that 2-to-1 decision, the U.S. Court of Appeals with the D.C. Circuit stated that while rates charged for in-state prison calls could be extraordinarily high, the FCC exceeded its legal authority in 2015 when it created rate caps for such calls. The FCC initially prepared a legal defense of its decision, but abandoned it earlier this year after you became chairman. And in a June 13 article in the New York Times, they attribute this decision to you. Chairman Pai, am I correct that in opposing the Commission's efforts to protect families and inmates from outrageously high rates for calling services, you were not endorsing astronomically expensive prices? Rather, you simply believe that Congress has not provided FCC with the authority to impose rate caps on intrastate prison calls?
Correct, Senator. That is a purely legal position that we took, and I would welcome additional authority should Congress see fit to provide it.
Thank you. So looking ahead, I plan to work with my colleagues to help address that issue. And in fact, I plan to introduce the Video Visitation and Inmate Calling in Prisons Act to rein in the often ridiculous prices prisoners and their families are forced to pay to communicate. The bill would provide the FCC with clear authority to institute common sense rules for video visitation and inmate calling services, including capping outrageously high rates, and would require the Bureau of Prisons to institute long overdue rules to make sure video visitation service contracts are effectively managed and overseen. If enacted, this good government, consumer-oriented legislation will help establish video visitation as a supplement to and not a replacement of in-person visitation, with the ultimate goal of reducing recidivism through increased family contact and regular communications. I believe that this legislation would address your concerns about clarifying FCC authority when it comes to prison calling services. Will you commit to working with me to pass this legislation during the 115th Congress?
I will, Senator. I look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you. And I believe, Mr. Carr, you had previously committed to this as well. And I'd like to give Commissioner Rosenworcel, both of you, the opportunity as well.
Absolutely, I would commit to working with you. I mean, the number that sticks with me here is there are 2.7 million children in this country who have a parent in prison. And we know that recidivism is affected by the ability to stay in close contact with family. So I think it is imperative that the FCC continue its work here, and I would work with you in any way to make sure that that legislation is successful.
Thank you. Mr. Carr?
Yes, Senator, I agree. I would welcome the chance to work with you on this issue.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenworcel, on June 22nd, President Trump announced that his infrastructure proposal will promote and foster enhanced broadband access for rural America. According to the FCC's 2016 Broadband Progress Report, 56% of rural Illinoisans lack adequate broadband service, as opposed to only 4% of urban communities in Illinois. Ensuring that every Illinoisan has reliable internet access to find a job, improve their businesses, or educate their children is a top priority. And in fact, many of our kids can't do their homework because they don't have broadband. While we still haven't seen any actual details on the administration's infrastructure package, several accounts suggest it will rely heavily on various forms of tax incentives to encourage providers to deploy and upgrade broadband in rural areas. And some have expressed support for using Connect America Fund as a mechanism for distributing potential infrastructure funding. Is this an appropriate mechanism, the Connect America Fund, and how would you modify the program to accommodate this role to ensure that funding injected into the system supplements industry investments and does not actually take over?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. It's an important one and also complicated, so let me try to give you a quick answer. I think what is most important to me here is something I mentioned to one of your colleagues earlier, that if there are additional programs as a result of an infrastructure package, it is absolutely imperative that we think about how they work in conjunction with the FCC's annual $4.5 billion fund for universal service. I think it's imperative that the right hand talks to the left and we don't duplicate efforts or somehow wind up with policies that crowd out private investment that would have occurred without that spending.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, along with your fellow commissioners, you've highlighted the importance of consensus-based decision-making at the FCC and expressed frustration about delegated authority. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. You issued a press release in December of 2014 with Commissioner O'Reilly about these concerns. And similarly, Commissioner Clyburn expressed frustration earlier this month about learning that the FCC approval of the Sinclair-Benton deal, through a press release. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a 2014 press release from Chairman Pai and a July 2017 tweet from Commissioner Clyburn.
Without objection.
Thank you. In August of last year, the FCC voted 3-2 to adopt new disclosure requirements for shared service agreements. Is that correct?
I believe that date is correct, yes.
So subject to approval by OMB, each broadcasting station that is party to a shared service agreement, whether in the same or different television markets, would be required to file a copy of the SSA in its online public inspection file. Chairman Pai, did FCC withdraw its request to OMB to approve the collection of SAA information on January 27, 2017? And if so, why? And does the FCC plan to resubmit its request to OMB?
Senator, I confess I'm not familiar with that particular information collection at this point, but I'm happy to get back to you with a status report on where that information collection stands.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel and Mr. Carr, were you aware of that development?
Because I no longer serve at the agency right now, I don't have up-to-date details on that, but were I confirmed, I'd be perfectly happy to follow up with you and provide you with more information.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Similarly, I don't recall right now the specifics of that one.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being very kind. And again, Chairman Pai, I apologize for having to cancel our meeting yesterday. You've been very generous, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. I think that exhausts the questions for today. So again, I want to thank all of our nominees for being here, for your testimony, for your responses to our questions. As was pointed out earlier, some of the most exciting things that are happening in the digital economy fall under this committee's jurisdiction and under the regulatory authority of the FCC. And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to advance the new technologies and make sure that people all across the country, no matter where they live, have access to high-speed internet and all the advantages that come with that are available to people in populated areas around the country as well. So we're looking forward to moving this process along. And again, thank you for your willingness to serve, for your families, for their dedication and commitment to the worthy cause of public service. And we'll look forward to hopefully being able to get the nomination process, confirmation process, I should say, moving quickly. I want to enter into the record on behalf of Senator Nelson 4 letters of support for Jessica Rosenworcel's nomination to the FCC, and would also say that we're going to keep the hearing record until Friday, July 21st. And during that time, senators are asked to submit any other questions that they might have for the record. Upon receipt, we would ask our witnesses to submit their written answers to the committee by July 31st so that we can get you all scheduled for a markup real soon. With that, I think this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
And the other has declined to be interviewed, and obviously he's the key person in this investigation. So I mean, I just you know, I don't know any more than whatever has been reported.
Governor, can you weigh in that this has nothing to do with the Somali community? This is a Minneapolis police officer. Somalis are law-abiding citizens in this state. This is an isolated incident. He just happens to be a Somali officer. That doesn't mean that we have Somali community has to explain themselves. He's a police officer, member of the Minneapolis Police Department. Somalis has nothing to do with this. Somalis have a concern with the way the police deals with them. We express deep condolence with the loved ones of this case, and we also demand answers what happened and why the shooting took place. We have the same concern like the family, like any other citizen in the street of this state, and we don't have to explain ourselves that because the officer just happened to be a Somali officer.
I would agree. I don't think there should be any implication to the broader Somali community or communities in Minnesota because of this incident. It was a single incident involving a single officer, two officers, one who fired, reportedly is one who fired his weapon, and that should be viewed as its own separate from anything else. As I said at the time about Mr. Castile, that was, again, it was not my comments were not in any way a statement on law enforcement generally or on any community. It was directed toward that specific incident, and I certainly would want to emphasize that as well in this regard.
Governor, are you as frustrated as everybody else by the lack of information in this case and how many days it's taken to learn much of what happened?
Well, the BCA was on the site immediately, and they are taking whatever, you know, I'm not an expert, whatever forensic evidence and other evidence available. There was, you know, in marked contrast to the Mr. Castile's shooting where there was video cameras and dash cams and others, so there was a lot of information quickly available, they're just has not been, whatever the determination they've made in forensic evaluations about various aspects of the event are confidential. But without one of the law enforcement officers being willing to talk about what happened, I think BCA itself, I'm just speculating here, is also stymied by the lack of available information. They put out a call for any witnesses. To my knowledge, when I've been told, there's no known other witnesses to the event. So I think everybody's very wants answers that are not immediately forthcoming, and I don't know when they will be forthcoming.
Officer Nora has exercised his right to not subject himself to an interview yet. As a public servant, as a police officer, should he?
I'm not going to comment on that. He's entitled to make that decision, and he has constitutional rights as well as state law that protects his decision to speak or not speak, so I'm not going to comment on that.
Are you concerned with the spate of shootings of police officers, shootings by police officers of civilians? If you are in Minnesota, and if you are, what are those concerns?
Well, I'm certainly concerned. I'm concerned with any one incident is one far too many. It underscores the importance of the training, the funds that the legislature provided, that the post board is going to be administering, and I would defer to others with more expertise than I what can possibly be done to prevent this from happening and never happening again, recognizing that these are individual law enforcement officers. There are thousands of them patrolling the state every moment, day and night, and they are put into these situations that are very incident specific, and they're having to make very quick, if not instantaneous, decisions about how they're going to proceed. And so it's to say you're going to have a blanket training program or any other program that's going to encompass all of that and give people that whatever additional level of training or expertise they need to make different decisions in that split second are ones that we certainly will pursue, but it's just realistically we can do the best we can, but we're not going to make human beings perfect.
Do you worry that the paucity of information and the dribbling of the information and the way it's come out, in fact, even the way the BCA put out its first release, pointing to a person who, upon questioning, knew nothing of the case, is going to fuel skepticism and actually fear the police department? Are you concerned about that?
I'm not aware that the person who was identified by the BCA was ignorant about the case. I don't know. I don't have any information. First I've heard of that. I don't know. I'll certainly check with Commissioner Doman and see that they have whoever is going to be making whatever statements as well informed as can be. Again, I'm just saying, and I'm not privy to the BCA, but the paucity of information here, available information, you've got whatever physical evidence and whatever, ballistic or other tests that they can perform, which they're going to undertake with the greatest urgency. But there are only two people who are alive who witnessed the incident, and the BCA was prepared to interview the first officer the next morning or as soon as possible thereafter, and he took until yesterday morning before he and through his attorney agreed to be interviewed, and that interview was extensive, over 4 hours, I'm told. And the BCA, can't compel the other testimony. So, I think the BCA is doing all it can as rapidly as it can, and there just is not very much other information or evidence available to them. Now, they'll have to, I'm not, again, qualified to say what else they're looking into, but they'll certainly, complete that work as soon as they possibly can and provide that information to the Hennepin County Attorney, which is what they're required to do.
With respect
how worried are you now that we've had Jamar Clark, we've had Philando Castillo, now Mr. Damon? How worried are you about the image of this state as others see us, not across the United States, but across the world?
Well, I have deep regrets anytime I see Minnesota portrayed in less than a very positive light, which I think is what we deserve and have earned and what we want our image to be. So it's very concerning in this case. You know, my greatest concern is for the individual who, Justine Damon, and for her family who have suffered this grievous loss. And that's the overriding concern I have.
Governor, last night a lot of media from Australia and across the world had asked the assistant police chief and mayor if our Minnesota policing system is trigger happy. And after these high-profile officer-involved shootings, what can we do as a state to look at this issue that some think is systemic?
Well, again, that's where I think this training program is so important, is both looking at it, but is also asking people with that training expertise what is most successful in terms of giving officers that perspective that they need to make split-second decisions and to make them be the right decisions. I don't think trigger happy is an appropriate term to apply to Minnesota law enforcement. And again, we're all dependent on them to be patrolling every minute of every day and night to keep us safe, and they encounter all sorts of really extremely difficult situations. And I think 99.99% of the time they conduct themselves admirably and with restraint and with the caution they recognize, too, the power that they have and the authority they have.
Chairman, with respect to witnesses, the BCA statement last night said that there was a bicyclist who stopped and saw part of the incident, and they're calling for him to step forward. Would you use this platform to do this?
Certainly ask anybody who has any knowledge that was present at the site or saw anything related to the site. I urge them, ask them to please come forward and share that information with the BCA. That would be a vital, important contribution to what I'm told is that they, saw a bicyclist and then saw him again after the shot was fired and the Mrs. Damon was on the pavement, and not they don't believe a video of the incident itself. But whatever they have, whatever anybody has, we certainly deeply appreciate receiving.
Governor, would you clarify for us once again what contacts you've had with the BCA on this and what you've learned from them?
Well, I've been in contact with Commissioner Doman, who notified Chief of Staff, myself, within minutes. On Saturday night, or it was early Sunday morning. By then, I've had numerous conversations. I've had two different face-to-face meetings with her. We have updated on the situation. We've been in frequent contact. My Chief of Staff has been in very frequent contact with her and the BCA officials. So we're closely involved and closely advised.
Have you directed them to make this a priority?
To make it an absolute first priority, yes, I certainly have, and they are doing so without my urging. They recognize the urgency of the situation. They recognize the enormous desire on everyone's part to be informed about what information is available. So they are giving this their absolute top priority.
And you've urged them to release information as quickly as possible?
I've urged them to do what they normally do in an instance like this, that is both as responsive as possible to the desire for information, and that also protects the integrity of the investigation and protects whatever or honors whatever laws or regulations that are applicable that guide what can and can't be done, what can and can't be said, and to whom and when. But the overriding effort, and they are very cognizant of this, is to provide what information is available that can be shared as quickly as possible, and proceed as quickly as possible.
Governor, you said you spoke to the Australian consulate.
I left a message.
You left a message on a voicemail, or?
I spoke there to a receptionist or an executive assistant. I didn't get her name, but I spoke to a person there.
And what was the message?
I said that I was governor of Minnesota, and given the incident that happened, I wanted to just offer whatever support or assistance I could. And again, Chief of Staff's been in touch with the contact the White House gave us to the secretary at the U.S. State Department about the protocol and the like, and she's been in conversation with the Minneapolis city authorities and the Hennepin County authorities regarding what information, certain protocols for how certain information needs to be communicated, what needs to transpire in order for it to be officially received, communication and the like. So we've been trying to learn and then follow that protocol, but be as forthcoming as we can be. And we will continue to be.
Have you talked to Mayor Hodges?
I've not spoken with her, no. My chief of staff again has talked with her top deputy on a frequent basis.
Any question? Yeah, if I may just change subjects. Eric Carr has filed a second suit trying to intervene in the governor versus legislature suit, trying to get them to overturn both the stipulation and to kill the plaintiff's case. The question that he raised in that interview was, why go through this process of the stipulation of getting funding through the courts rather than going through the legislative process? Why use that process rather than the normal process?
Well, because I didn't fund the House and the Senate, and the legislative session was over, and they have not agreed to return to discuss the issues that I set forth, and so we haven't had a special session. So legally, constitutionally, the other alternative for them to be funded for their essential services is through the district court judge. That's the procedure we followed in 2011 when the executive branch shut down. We had the district court judge through his magistrate make those allocation decisions, and that's been established procedure as far as I know. I'm not a constitutional expert, and I'm not a lawyer. As far as I know, that's an established practice in these instances in Minnesota.
Governor, the United States Senate has failed to vote to repeal Obamacare and replace it as they said they would, but President Trump says he's going to allow it to die. Could I get your reaction to the non-vote and then the, I guess, suggestion that it's going to wither, and what was expected from Minnesota?
Well, I was surprised that the Republican leadership and majority in the U.S. House of Representatives didn't recognize the catastrophic effect that this legislation would have on so many Minnesotans and other Americans, and they coupled it with a reduction in taxes for the very wealthiest Americans. I mean, the CBO's estimated 26 million Americans are going to lose their health insurance over the following decade. It should have been enough to turn anybody's vote around on that. So in the Senate, the Democrats, 48 Democrats stood in shoulder to shoulder and said the measures that had been proposed by the Senate Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, were as bad, if not worse, than the House bill. And enough Republican senators agreed with them to thwart legislation passing in order to have Obamacare eliminated without any replacement, which it's one thing to criticize from the sidelines, and it's another thing to then have to take responsibility and create something better, implement it, which they've proven incapable of doing. I'm glad the bill failed. Again, it would have had catastrophic effects on Minnesota. When it took effect, it would be very destabilizing until it took effect. And that's why governors from both parties, our National Governors Association last weekend, Democrats were very outspoken. Republicans were more restrained, but Republican governors, many of the ones I talked with, had the same concerns that Democratic governors had in terms of the very negative impact on their states.
Governor, back to the Minneapolis shooting situation for a moment. As you've reflected on this, and I'm sure you have, Do you think these three high-profile cases, Castillo, Jamar Clark, and now Damon, are they an unfortunate, tragic, coincidental series of events, or are they indicative of the fact that Minnesota law enforcement needs better training?
Well, I think most Minnesota law enforcement is very well trained and conducts itself very responsibly in ever increasingly difficult situations in our cities and across the state. To draw conclusions from three incidents, tragic as they are, requires somebody to really do a more careful analysis than I've been able to do. If there are, conclusions that can be made, and there's any shortcomings that become established, then we certainly look at that. And again, the overall training component of the legislature approved for for law enforcement statewide will, again, focus on and will be different from one community to another, but focus on what they identify as areas that need to be strengthened. So, but to say that cast a blanket judgment across the state, I think is not supported by the information so far in these three instances.
Back to healthcare, with what has not happened in Washington, what's that mean for the individual market here?
Well, we did a tremendous amount to shore up the individual market in Minnesota. The premium rebate, the 25%, has been very effective. It has not reached as many people. The belief is that not as many people are signing up for that care, which is its own commentary that's concerning. But the program itself is being administered well and is providing, from everything I've told, relief to those Minnesotans who certainly need it and deserve it. The reinsurance, what they're talking about doing in Washington now, just preliminarily, about working together in a bipartisan way to correct some of the deficiencies in the Affordable Care Act and stabilize the individual insurance market. What they keep coming back to is reinsurance, which is exactly what we instituted at the state level. And I met last week with Secretary Price and the CMS Administrator Verman about approving as rapidly as possible the Minnesota waiver, which was the last green light we need to move the Minnesota program for the next 2 years. So I think we're on the cutting edge of what governments are doing at this point to try to improve that market stability. But it's expensive. I mean, we spent $870 million among those 2 years of the reinsurance and then the premium relief. We allocated that amount of money. I don't know if we'll end up spending it all, but it's very expensive, and it's not something the state can afford to continue on an ongoing basis. So the federal government step in and provide significant resources to do what's necessary to stabilize the individual market is crucial. And I think there should be a bipartisan approach, which the Republicans in Congress have totally rejected up until this point, and the president's rejected. But hopefully at this point, it's not about letting Obamacare die. That would be unconscionable and have devastating, life-threatening effects for thousands of Minnesotans. It's about working together and saying what's best for the people of Minnesota, what's best for the people of this country. How can we make this existing program, which from all accounts is going to continue to be in place for the foreseeable future, how can we improve it for the benefit of Americans?
Do you expect more policies?
This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters Live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters Live service. This is the primary audio circuit.